All right, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin with a special time known as Rule Discussion with whoever. Part 39. I'm jumping in. What's up, dude? I'm muted. Shit, let's try again. What's up, dude?
Hello?
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Today has been pretty kick-ass. Yesterday was complete ass. The day before that was good. So it's been back and forth, but overall we're doing pretty well. How are
Such
you?
is life on the internet, huh?
Oh yeah. All kinds of unexpected memes. What is that? Oh god. Actually,
Yeah. Well, I'm doing fine. I'm house sitting, so bit of an unfamiliar locale tonight.
Mm-hmm. Do you bring a laptop or something?
Oh, I bring my whole rig.
That's awesome.
But yeah, I'm here for like a week, so it made sense.
Oh,
If I only house sit for like a day or two, then yeah, I'll bring a laptop or something.
Mm-hmm. I was gonna say you sound about the same.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
I can't go a week without my computer.
Yeah. It's basically a survival need to people like us in the 21st century who are so connected with everything. If you don't have it, it's kind of like, what do I do?
Window to the world.
Yeah.
10,000 years of accumulated human knowledge all in one cyberspace. You kind of get hooked on it.
Yep. And when you get unplugged, it's like, I can't breathe. I have to go to the library. Going places. Ugh.
God, I can't remember the last time I went to a library.
Shh, be quiet.
Yeah, it's been a while. Well, did anything catch your eye the past week?
Yeah, there's a person, and I didn't really chase the story because it seemed kind of like more of a social issue than a political one, but I know that it had political ramifications. There's a guy who people allege that there was a sexual assault or something, and I think he's supposed to have some key position now or soon. And he had a hearing or something, and I saw a mashup of that with the interrogation in Pulp Fiction. That's basically the extent of my knowledge. It seemed like it fit really well. But so what's with that? What is that?
That's pretty good. Yeah, that's the Cavanaugh hearings. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He's up for the Supreme Court.
Uh-huh.
And the hearings process, the nomination process is what we're seeing right now. So the nomination process, the president nominates a guy for the Supreme Court, and then, ostensibly, Congress is supposed to basically vet him by whatever criteria they see fit, and then there's a vote, and then if he gets enough votes, then he's in. So the process has been drug out a bit in this case because there was a allegation by, I hope I'm remembering her name right, one Dr. Ford, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And she accused Cavanaugh, Judge Cavanaugh, of having sexually assaulted her, I believe, was the allegation, in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So ostensibly there was a party, and Cavanaugh and a friend apparently held her down and tried to have sex with her, whereupon she was able to escape, basically. So she was apparently traumatized by that, and so sat on that for a long time, because there's a lot of literature about how victims are not frequently are not willing to come forward with report a given sex crime of that variety, because of stigma, fear, anxiety, etc., as well as the possibility that the police just won't believe them. So for a long time, she kept it to herself, but then when Cavanaugh was nominated for the Supreme Court, basically, she came out with the allegation, and apparently it was initially supposed to be kind of on the lowdown. It was kind of supposed to be confidential, but then eventually she changed her mind and decided to come out in the quote-unquote public interest. So there's a lot of politics around that, whether or not it was leaked, whether or not her confidential report had been leaked purposely to try to pressure her or not, but there's no proof really here nor there. So the allegation kind of came out, and so she's come out and formally had the hearing this past week, I think it was, in which she came in, sat before the committee and answered questions, kind of clarified her allegations. And then Cavanaugh came on afterwards and then tried to answer questions in order to basically defend himself against the allegations. So that particular day was sort of the big one. That's what led to a lot of the media attention. It's kind of been building up. It had been building up for a while, but that one hearing that day in which they were both actually there was the big media storm. So everybody, that's kind of the debate right now. Kind of centers around Cavanaugh's fitness for the court, as predicated on his performance in that hearing and predicated on the allegations against him. So there's a big debate about that.
There's one, if you're kind of taking it from the social side, which I think is not really the area of expertise that you have, but this is something that Pact has studied quite a lot. And that is the action of coming out with an accusation long after something was purported to have happened, and how a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's cheap, they're just saying that because they want this person to fail. But something to put in front of you is that that's a really big risk for the accuser as well as the accused. So it's not just like an easy move you can play on, like, I don't like this person, let's just make this really aggressive accusation against them when they're kind of trying to get into a key position to try and mess them up. That also opens yourself up to fire from other people in other groups and can limit your opportunities moving forward as well. So I feel like for something that happened a really long time ago, it's hard to get hard evidence like you would get for a sort of police investigation in case, but the social risk of doing that is very high. So that's something that I would kind of point out here, where a baseless accusation is a really stupid thing to do. So I would say it's likely that she's basing it on a real experience. And if it was me, just kind of taking the mental exercise of someone assaulted me and now they're trying to have a Supreme Court position, fuck no, dude. That's like the highest seat of justice in the country. I would want people to know about that. So on that hand, I feel like there's a lot of room for empathy there. Of if you were in that position, you would want to speak up about it too, because you want the people who are in that position to really care about doing the right thing and making sure that the right things happen to good people. And bad people get their justice and that kind of stuff. So it's tough. And I feel like this is with the modern drama of a lot of these, like the Me Too movement and accusations and stuff like that, it is very fresh in terms of stuff that we talk about now that used to not be talked about. But that doesn't make it any less legitimate because we're still figuring this out. Again, it's an accusation, but bearing in mind how big of a risk it is, I feel like it's something to bear in mind.
Well, that's the big question. I mean, to what degree should an allegation like this weigh on a Supreme Court nomination hearing on the process?
Yeah, do we have precedent for this?
The one that comes to mind is Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. That's the one that kind of the media keeps bringing up. So Judge Thomas, I hope I'm getting his name right, was nominated to the Supreme Court, and a woman named Anita Hill came out with some allegations against him, and that turned that nomination battle into a bit of a fight. Not as big as this one. It was a very different context in 1990 or whenever it was. So there wasn't sort of this overarching, Me Too movement, social movement that kind of tied in, dovetailed to the nomination battle. But at the same time, there was a big question about, all right, did this happen? If it did happen, what do we do about it? How seriously should we take this? Should it influence our decision on whether or not this person should be on the Supreme Court? So, in that case, There was a long battle, but eventually he was nominated. He did end up on the Supreme Court. That's maybe the closest you could come. Off the top of my head, that's the example that comes to mind. I haven't researched this a whole lot, because my assumption pretty much from the start was that Cavanaugh would end up on the Supreme Court, and that if by some chance he didn't, then somebody just like him would basically take his place. I mean, there's almost certainly going to be a majority conservative, quote-unquote conservative, Supreme Court going forward, one way or the other. So institutionally speaking, this is kind of a done deal. So I hadn't really been following it all that closely. So the allegations that came out in the subsequent battle kind of changed the context of the nomination a bit, because now it's almost more of a social than political issue. You know, like you point out, I'm not as familiar with that particular aspect. So I'm kind of a latecomer to it. I've been researching it a little more, reading more about it more recently over the past week since that big hearing. But from what I know, the closest you could come as far as a precedent would be the Anita Hill allegations in the 1990 nomination process. So in that sense, yes, allegations like that are taken into consideration, but in that case, it was not enough to block the nomination. So, but however, that said, it's important to point out that this is not actually a trial, as much as it might feel like one. This is actually purely vetting. This is purely Congress just exploring the nominee's professionalism, his conduct, his reputation, etc. So nominally, it's not about establishing guilt. It's not about establishing whether or not something did or did not happen. It's about vetting whether or not this person passes some arbitrary bar of acceptable qualifications.
It's a non-physical fitness test.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. So it's not a court case in that sense. And the reason I bring that up is because it's not necessarily relevant then that there is or is not precedent. Because every generation basically has to decide for itself what constitutes the moral bar, so to speak, that arbitrary bar that a given nominee has to clear in order to gain votes. So in that sense, given that it's an arbitrary subjective bar, measure, that's going to differ from period to period, from generation to generation. You can't really cite precedent per se, because you could argue, well, in 1990, people felt differently than we do now, so we have a different measure. We're going to use a different arbitrary bar in order to kind of gauge whether or not this person is acceptable. So that's part of why this process is so contentious, because a lot of it is so subjective. You know, again, to what degree should these allegations weigh on the process? You know, how should they weigh? How should they be considered? Are they enough to block the nomination or not? And so that's just inherently subjective. You know, do you believe Dr. Ford? Do you believe Judge Kavanaugh? Is there enough evidence one way or the other to determine who to believe? All of that comes down to very subjective kind of gut instincts, you know, gut judgments, so to speak. And that's making the process very difficult. You know, there's not really a rock-solid way to prove one way or the other what really happened. And even if there were, there's a whole other debate about how relevant that is to establishing the professionalism of a judge, and and the veracity of his record. Well, the veracity of the allegations to his ability to be an impartial judge on the Supreme Court. I suspect people would say, yes, the allegations are relevant, but there is a discussion there to be had. So the whole thing is very murky. It's very kind of subjective. And, you know, if anybody listening has listened to me before, I'm not really the best. You know that I'm not the best at teasing out subjective things like that. So I'm not going to tell people what to believe on that. They can believe what they like. But I would add here, as a caveat, well, not a caveat, but just as a side note, the nomination process, as divorced from the Kavanaugh-Ford hearings and allegations, is becoming more and more messy. It's becoming more and more dysfunctional. And this started well before the Cavanaugh nomination process. It had already become more and more partisan over the past 10, 15 years. And then there was an escalation when the GOP stonewalled the nomination of a replacement for Justice Scalia, in order to, hypothetically, ostensibly, allegedly, if you will, stonewalled in order to make sure that the next president and not President Obama was the one who got to nominate that replacement. Which of course paid off, because eventually Donald Trump won the election in 2016 and was able to get that nomination and got his guy passed. I think that was Judge Gorsuch, if I'm remembering correctly. So that was iffy. Technically, it was legal for them to do that, but it kind of broke with established norms. I mean, you're not really supposed to block a nomination in order to wait for an election. So technically legal, but a little bit iffy, kind of bending the rules a little bit. Well, again, informal rules, not formal, but informal rules. So then, this brings us to the current situation, and there's lots of conspiracy theories about, all right, to what degree is this kind of fabricated, or to what degree is this being blown out of proportion by the Democratic Party in order to get votes for the midterm elections. So that may or may not be the case. Again, that's a judgment call too. And that's not an indictment on the veracity of the allegations. Again, it could be completely true, and the Democratic Party could be playing them up to get votes in the midterm elections. Those are not mutually exclusive possibilities. But the process has become so public and so strained that this seems to be a further deterioration in the set of political norms that govern the nominating process. And that would suggest a further deterioration, a further downward trend in the comedy, so to speak, in the, how should I say, peaceful, well, not peaceful, but the formal settlement of these kinds of processes. The reason that's important is because if the process does become more and more partisan, and because it becomes worse and worse with, new and new standards being set, moving the goalpost, etc., whatever a given political party, one or the other, deems necessary in order to get their preferred outcome. If that continues on a downward trend, it delegitimizes the process, and there's a threat that, in turn, overarching governing institutions could be delegitimized. So in that sense, it would be much better if, in the future, both political parties could establish a new set of governing norms to adhere to during these kinds of nominations, these nominating processes, if not other areas of government, in order to try to make sure that they don't turn into these sort of pitched ideological battles. That's not to say, again, that these allegations should not be investigated, that they didn't happen, just that they should be managed more, shall we say, professionally.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely seems like a shit show, and for an office like this, you would kind of want someone who people were excited to have be a Supreme Court justice, just in the basic human moral sense. Because we've talked about that before, about you have institutions and you have rules, but ultimately you are governing primates who have those like basic like physiological responses to a lot of social situations. So this is a very visceral social situation, and you have someone who maybe the allegations are true, maybe they're not, but the fact that it's contested is going to put a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And if he does get in, it really kind of brings into question, like, what kind of people are we okay with putting on the Supreme Court? Like, how does this make sense from a basic human moral perspective, as opposed to like a political one of, well, if he's of my party, I'm obligated to support him regardless of this vetting process. Because like you said, that's just the kind of voting along party lines and playing the sports team of politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a hard balance to strike, especially when there is so much competition happening. So there's no good answer to that. That's just kind of something that political leadership on both sides of the political spectrum has to kind of reach some kind of consensus on. We're definitely not in an era of consensus, so that's probably unlikely for the short to medium term at least. But basically it's just a bad sign, is as much as I would say about it. It's not really a healthy, it does not suggest a healthy political process or political system.
I don't know if it was during our session last week or if I was talking about this between sessions, but the voice that isn't really cohesive but seems like the one we need in the United States is the voice of the moderate. Like the people who aren't strongly Democrat or strongly Republican, but they are American citizens and they do care. They're just not drumming up the support of any particular party. Like getting their perspective on stuff like this seems to be the most important, because otherwise it's just the two teams shouting at each other, and you don't actually have a sense of what the public wants.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a role to be played by moderates in trying to act as the voice of reason and trying to cool tensions and reach some kind of negotiated outcome that is at least somewhat amenable to all parties involved. But the trouble is, there's an underlying social and political force or forces at work that are kind of driving the tension, and addressing them is addressing that root cause is ultimately going to be the real solution. Be that by direct action or just kind of letting the process play out. So in that sense, yes, moderates definitely should kind of try to speak up and try to kind of be that voice to try to soothe things over. But on the other hand, it probably won't happen because we're sort of in the middle of and we've talked about this before, we're in a very tumultuous period of history right now in which there are major structural changes to the economy, changing the way that people live and make a living, and upsetting established modes of making a living. And we're in a period of corresponding social change, changing the way that we relate, challenging established social norms, customs, etc. So all of that is creating a big sort of frothing mass of social and economic instability.
I thought you were going to say shit.
Well, also accurate, also applicable. But that has to work itself out that's going to manifest politically as basically the process we're seeing now, as political tensions, as all of these new economic and social interests emerge and voice their political preferences, and they're clashing with the established political, economic, and social forces. And so eventually, hopefully, a new political equilibrium can be reached, if not also an economic equilibrium that will facilitate consensus, such that there is a set of norms that everybody can agree to and will observe that facilitates stable, predictable governance, and if not also, again, economic performance. Again, jobs, capital, investment, etc. That's the ideal. So if that's true, if that is the way the process is going to be panning out, we need to, one, wait, be patient. To a degree, the process just needs to be allowed to work itself out so that everybody feels heard and everybody has a chance to kind of express their preferences, and then we can kind of have that final negotiation about what set of norms would best suit all parties involved and balance out those different interests. But then on the other hand, we also need to be at least somewhat proactive in trying to police the worst excesses of those competing political, economic, and social forces to ensure no one force ends up dominating the others in a way that ensures perpetual conflict of some variety. Low-level political and social conflict, if not also eventually outright violence. So maintaining political stability is the gold standard. Again, we've talked before about how political stability is what makes the United States a superpower. That undergirds everything else. That undergirds American military power, American economic power, etc. It comes down to that underlying political stability. So making sure that political stability can survive this era of tumult should be one of the principal objectives. And in so much as we do take direct action to try to, maybe not police, but participate in that political and social process that's unfolding, it should be to try to protect that at least. Now, anything more than that kind of comes down to subjective preferences, whether you think one side or the other, or a given cause or some other cause is right, wrong, or whatever. That comes down to individuals. That's up to people to decide for themselves. But political stability is very difficult to get back once you lose it. So it's important to, at the very least, protect institutions to ensure they survive, as well as at least some of the corresponding institutional norms that maintain the legitimacy of those institutions. So whatever has to be done to do that should be a priority. That's not to say that does not preclude other priorities. Again, the process has to be allowed to play out. the various forces have to be allowed to compete and some eventual settlement made. But in the meantime, just make sure that you don't blow up the system while it's happening. So that would be, I guess that's my commentary on it. That's about as much as I could say on that.
Yeah, to give it a very basic sort of analogy, it's kind of like if the American family is not going to get along, then no one gets a holiday ham kind of a thing. Because we all benefit from being a part of a system that has been historically quite stable. But if we ruin it and we decide not to get together for the holidays, then it's not going to be all the delicious pies and all that stuff, and then everyone is sad. So it's one of those things where, yes, it's good to stand up for what you believe in and what you want to change and stuff like that, but not to the point where you eat each other alive, because then no one really gets any benefit.
Yeah, you don't have to look far in history to see examples of societies that have suffered immensely for lack of political stability. It's just very hard to unwind conflict once it emerges. And tensions can be very difficult to tamper down once they reach a certain boiling point. It's hard to walk that back. Yugoslavia is an example of that. There just came a point when the conflict just kind of had a momentum of its own. Most people did not want to fight a civil war. It's not as though most people in Yugoslavia in the 80s were like, hey, let's fight a huge-ass civil war that's going to kill shit tons of people 5 years from now. Let's do that. Really, it was a pretty small minority of people that really wanted to fight. But just by dint of the way conflicts work, that small minority was able to drag the rest of the population with them. Once institutions collapse, it's not hard for a vocal, armed minority to have a disproportionate voice in affairs. So having a strong civil society and strong civil institutions is very important to precluding that and to navigating and negotiating the major differences between the major political and social interests in a given society. So that's kind of beating a dead horse, I guess, repeating the same thing over and over again, but you get the gist of it. That would be my overarching takeaway from the Cavanaugh hearings. Obviously, there's also the narrative about the Me Too movement and to what degree society, if not also political institutions, takes into consideration the unique suffering and unique problems of women who have suffered sexual assault. Like, how do you factor that into social norms, political norms, etc.? That's a whole nother conversation, and that's definitely not one that I know enough about to comment on with any confidence. So I'm not going to get into that. I would leave that to people more knowledgeable than I am. So hopefully I have been delicate enough to avoid that particular landmine. I apologize if not. Was there anything else that caught your eye?
There was just some more stupid tweets. Something about, I think was it the Kentucky rally or something? Trump said something about him and Kim Jong-un fell in love, and then Kim Jong-un called him old, and then he called him short and fat, and it just basically went into schoolyard bullshit. But no surprises there. North Korea, US memes, schoolyard bullshit. No one's really that surprised.
Negotiating process has not broken down, but it's kind of unclear what the status is.
Yeah.
US-North Korean negotiations have not completely stopped, but seem to have kind of stalled. It seems that there's not really agreement on how to go forward. The North Koreans want the US to mitigate sanctions, to reduce sanctions, if not remove them completely, before they get rid of their nuclear program, nuclear weapons, etc. Now, obviously, the United States wants basically the opposite. They want denuclearization before sanctions relief. So it's not really clear who's going to give ground, if anybody, on that. But meanwhile, the North Korean government has been negotiating with the South Korean government on some kind of peace deal, nominally. That's what they say, anyway. They say that they've reached an agreement in principle, basically, to reach an agreement in future. to sign a peace deal formally ending the Korean War, which technically has been ongoing since 1950. Technically. So they did that. They also had some nice photo op stuff. You know, they went to this mountain that's like volcano/mountain that's supposed to play a big role in sort of the founding mythos of the Korean people, and so they had a nice photo op where they're shaking hands on that, and everybody was very hunky. Everybody was very friendly and amiable, etc. But not a whole lot
Everybody
of
loves
substance.
mountains.
Yeah. A lot of superficial posturing, basically. But nominally, the South Korean, North Korean negotiations are ongoing, and there has been some meat to them. Not a lot, but they are at least trending in the right direction. They've been meeting off and on more or less continuously, and they've been making some progress, albeit intermittently and very incrementally. So from the outside, it almost looks a bit like the United States and South Korea are kind of doing a good cop, bad cop thing. Where the United States is sort of the unreasonable foreign barbarian that just wants to knock shit down and blow everything up. And the South Koreans are the good cop who wants to negotiate and wants to move forward and doesn't.
I was about to say, don't we though?
Well, debatable. Debatable. People can kind of judge that for themselves, the veracity and credibility of the administration's threats. But for the moment, the way the negotiations look is very much a kind of hot, cold, U.S. pressure, South Korean carrot kind of approach. And I don't know if that's purposeful or not. I don't know if the Trump administration kind of had that in mind with its current strategy. It may be that they negotiated in advance with the South Koreans, and this is kind of unfolding all according to some grand master plan. It could be that the administration just decided to take a hard line and is just sort of letting the chips fall where they may. And one of those chips happened to be a relatively dovish South Korean administration engaging in negotiation. I don't know enough about the process to judge one way or the other. Probably only insiders really do have that kind of information. But from the outside, nominally, that's what I'm kind of reading. That's sort of my impression of the negotiations thus far. So, in so much as there are progress in those negotiations going forward, they're probably going to be predicated on South Korean, North Korean negotiations more than they will be the U.S. North Korea negotiations. I expect any traction that comes from U.S. North Korean negotiations to really start from those South Korean initiated negotiations. Again, entirely uncertain as to just how committed the North Korean government actually is to denuclearization. Anybody's guess. Pretty clearly they want sanctions relief. That much is obvious. But just how much and what they're willing to give up to get it is unclear. We'll see. They are, in their characteristic fashion, dragging out the negotiating process as much as they can. That's a traditional North Korean stalling tactic. They've used it before. So this could well be the same thing again, and it could be that when there's a new president in office, or if some other change happens in the fundamental balance of power in the region, they could change tack very dramatically and suddenly. That's not unusual for the North Koreans. They have no qualms with dramatically doing much of anything. They can change diplomatic style and approach and change what they propose to accept or demand on the drop of a dime. Not on the drop of a dime. I'm not sure what that
Drop of a hat?
Thank you.
Turn on a dime, drop a hat.
There you go. Thank you. Yeah, that's very much in their tradition. So it remains to be seen. Current progress is encouraging as far as the South Korean negotiations are going. U.S. negotiations, again, kind of meh, but again, I don't think they're that important so long as the South Korean negotiations are progressing. But the ultimate outcome is still very uncertain, anybody's guess. I'm still very much in wait-and-see mode on the veracity of those negotiations. So that's roughly what I had. I don't really have big notes for the past week. I think most everything that happened from the past week is basically stuff that was already ongoing and just sort of developed further. So things are kind of on trend, basically. You know, Brexit is kind of entering a sort of terminal phase. Brexit negotiations are kind of entering their end game. Nominally, there's supposed to be a final Brexit agreement of some kind by the end of October. So there's been very heated negotiations between the United Kingdom and the European Union. But my perspective is that a lot of that is kabuki theater, basically, because there's a lot of division within the British government, specifically within the Tories, about what kind of Brexit agreement they actually want. The European Union roughly knows what it wants, or at least knows what it's willing to accept. So they're kind of flexible in a sense, in that sense. But the British government is really kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, so to speak. They're kind of stuck between people who want a hard Brexit, more of a free trade agreement style Brexit, and the people who kind of want more of a soft Brexit. The people who really want a customs union, basically, with the European Union. That's a simplification, but roughly that's kind of the division. So Prime Minister May is having to do this little song and dance to try to appease all parties and reach some kind of consensus within the British government, and the European Union, in turn, is doing a song and dance where they kind of try to pretend to be hard, to have a hard stance in order to try to encourage the soft Brexit people, but at the same time not be so hard that they make Prime Minister May look weak and make it seem like the hard Brexit people can launch a putsch and basically seize control of the process, if not throw Prime Minister May out entirely and replace her with one of their own people. And then that's to say nothing of the Labour Party in Britain, which is its own kind of mess. They themselves have not really quite decided whether or not they want a soft or hard Brexit. There's some debate even there. Nominally, Corbyn is kind of the head of the Labour Party, basically. I believe, and if you're British and listening to this and I'm getting this wrong, please correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. This is what I'm remembering, so keep me on the straight and narrow here. But Corbyn has nominally come out and said that he wants a customs union. I believe he has come out and said that's technically Labour's official position. There has been some pressure from within the Labour Party to get him to commit to another referendum. That's a lot more controversial. That's a much bigger ask. And so he's been cagey about that. So Labour Party's official position, again, I believe, is that they want a customs union. But that if Prime Minister May fails to reach any kind of agreement and proposes to Parliament that there be basically a hard Brexit, that Labour would then, in that case, push for another referendum. That's what I'm remembering. Again, please keep me honest on that. So that process involves a lot of political theater on the part of all parties involved, why they kind of jockey for position within their respective fields. Certainly within the Labour Party, within the Tories, within the British government writ large, and then also within the European Union.
The thing to remember, though, like you say theater, and I think some people think that that's like an act or it's fiction. And if we learned anything from the last big referendum for Brexit, it's that it has real consequences. This theater, it is theater, but it also affects people's lives and situations in a massive way. So you can't really just like willy-nilly dance around and have a fun time and expect nothing bad to happen.
Yeah, that's the accusation that the European Union has been throwing out. They've been saying that the British are the ones who are incurring this additional risk by not being able to come to a consensus. The British, for their part, well, it depends on who you ask. There's a big diversity. There's a lot of diversity of opinion within Britain on the Brexit process and where they stand. I would love to hear anybody from Britain's opinion on the matter in chat if they like. Participation is encouraged in that regard. First-hand accounts, opinions, etc., from the countries we talk about are very useful in informing, other people how you guys think, basically. So definitely participation is encouraged in that regard. This might be a good time for the usual disclaimer, since I already brought up fact-checking, basically. I'm not an expert in everything we talk about here, so if you're new to this, keep that in mind. I have a stronger background in economics and roughly foreign policy, but the other stuff is stuff that I've just read about on my own, so I'm not an expert in that stuff. So the purpose of this is more to share information and try to give people kind of an introduction to topics they may not know as much about, so that they can kind of better inform themselves, or to give them a gateway to try to get them involved in researching this, that, or the other topic. So if I say something stupid, biased, or wrong, I definitely encourage people to chime in and correct me. Because, again, if I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't want to misinform people. So, that said, that's my impression, roughly, of where the Brexit process is. You'll probably be... Sorry, go ahead.
There is someone who's saying, I don't know why Britain wanted to leave the EU. Nationalism was a big point of energy there. Just like being a country of people and the attitude that you're the best, and that if you're cooperating with other people, you're doing it because you're nice to them, but really you would be better off on your own. That kind of attitude was a really big driving force. Another one is that the EU has a lot of countries in it, and they're not all equal strength. And it is true that Britain is one of the stronger member states in the EU. So you have like the carries, which is what, Germany, Britain, France, I don't know. What are some of the other ones that are big?
No, those are definitely the big three.
Okay, so you have those ones, and a lot of times they help out other countries, like Greece has been needing a lot of help lately, and it's not just like you help them, you remember that you helped them, and you kind of think of yourselves as better, and you expect something in return for that. So Brexit is kind of like saying, yeah, well, what if we didn't help other people and we just did our own thing? There are other benefits when you're helping other countries and stuff, like it improves your image, and if you do have an excess, then sharing can be a good thing, but it's a really complicated and kind of new frontier. I don't know if anyone is aware of what Europe looked like hundreds of years ago, but it was kind of like everyone's attacking everyone. So this is a different stage.
Yeah.
And people are trying to find their place in it and how they want to think about their place in Europe.
Yeah, it is, and that's a very good summary. It is a part of this overarching conversation in Europe about what the European Union should look like in the future. How do Europeans want the European Union as an institution to evolve? Or not evolve? Do they want something else, an alternative? There's a lot of debate about sovereignty and immigration and etc. So that's very much a debate in the process that is unfolding and has not yet reached a conclusion. And so the British Brexit referendum was a British manifestation of the discontent in Britain that kind of emerged as part of that same process. There were some more specific issues at play. Immigration was a big one. Anybody living in Britain at that time probably remembers that immigration was a big part of the pro-Brexit campaign in the referendum. And there was a lot of talk about, well, for one, there was Islamic migration, which triggered some people. But there was also a lot of concern about Eastern European migrants. There was a fear that there would just be a flood of poverty-stricken Eastern Europeans coming into Britain and taking advantage of Britain's welfare system. So there was concern over that. There was concern over European Union centralized bureaucracy. One of the accusations frequently levied against the European Union is that it suffers from a democratic deficit. A lot of the officials in the European Union are not elected officials. They are appointed by governments or by basically the Council of Europe, which is a body of the European Union that is responsible for certain appointments, certain key appointments within the European Union bureaucracy. So there was a sense that the European Union bureaucracy was kind of overreaching, was taking too many powers away from sovereign governments. And there was a desire on many people in Britain to try to take back those sovereign rights that they perceived to be slipping away. There was also a desire, kind of like what you were saying, to part of what wealthier countries in the European Union do is pay into the European Union budget, and then that ends up being distributed, not only as distributed to certain programs, the European Union bureaucracy, etc., but also to poorer countries as part of development funds. So there was a sense of unfair wealth transfer, basically, that Britain was taking up a disproportionate share of the weight of funding the European Union. That was also another pro-Brexit perspective, if I'm remembering correctly. So that also tied into internal British politics. There was a guy, I know that's ambiguous. He was a radical. He was a radical Islamist, and I don't quite remember his name. If we have any British listening, they probably know his name right away. He was this established radical Islamist who had come to Britain basically on asylum, I think. And I don't remember quite where he came from. I want to say Jordan. But basically, the British government really, really wanted to extradite him back to where he came from, but they couldn't because torture was supposedly, allegedly used in that country. And British law, well, not British law, but ECG, sorry, European Court of Justice law, not even that, European Union law, and the ECJ, European Court of Justice, prevented them from extraditing. So a lot of people in Britain were very upset about that. He's a very memorable figure. He was kind of a little bit overweight and had an eye patch, and he had a, sort of stereotypical Islamist beard, so to speak. So, if you saw him, you would know him right away, but I can't remember his name off the top of my head. So there was a lot of tension generated from that over time that also kind of fed that anti-immigrant, anti-European Court of Justice mood that kind of fed that pro-Brexit sentiment in the UK before the referendum. I'm sure there was a lot of other minor sort of little political issues at the time that fed into it too, but I don't remember them. Again, somebody from Britain would be able to remember those much better than I could. But those were roughly some significant contributing factors to the Brexit victory in the referendum. I might also add, there was a sense that the European Union kind of always got its way, and that the direction of the European Union's evolution was in the hands of institutional actors and not in the hands of the public. So, for example, there were negotiations around a new treaty to try to expand powers of the European Union bureaucracy and try to expand basically the remit of the European Union writ large. And I believe that was the Lisbon Treaty. And what happened was that got shot down in 2 referenda in France and the Netherlands, if I'm remembering correctly. I think we do have a Dutch guy who listens who says that he's kind of our go-to for Dutch politics. He might be able to color that a little bit, but from what I remember, that was the case. The Dutch and the French shot it down, and without unanimous, basically, passage in all countries involved, it couldn't go through. So what did they do? They basically went back, renegotiated the treaty, and changed a few things here and there, and then had another referendum, whereupon it passed. So the accusation is that the pro-European Union side of that overarching European debate basically just has referenda over and over again until they get their outcome, get the outcome that they want, which the which the pro-Brexit people, shall we say, think is unfair and undemocratic. They think that there should be a different process, that there should be, that the process should be more democratic, that there should be more democratic legitimacy to the process. So that also played a role. Now, of course, there's a countervailing set of opinions that are pro-European, but I won't get into that unless somebody kind of really wants to. But basically, to answer the question, why did they leave? That's roughly why. Again, I would welcome input from British people on that to try to give that some color. So with that, wait, how did I get onto that?
Someone asked about they don't know why Brexit happened. So we did.
Yeah, before that.
I just read. Yeah, I just read that one from the chat.
Oh, yeah, I thought that fed into something else we were talking about, but it slips my mind. Oh, anyway, I'm sure chat will remember. They can kind of help us out. Let's see. So we've got some questions. So let's see. Can the White House tell the FBI how to conduct an investigation into a Supreme Court judge nominee? I don't think so. Because I think that is an independent process. I think the process is nominally under the control of the Justice Department. I hope somebody corrects me on that if I'm wrong, but I believe the Justice Department is more responsible for that. Will have kind of the lead, or at least roughly influence over the process. Obviously, the FBI itself will carry out the investigation. Hypothetically, I think the Justice Department could give direction of some kind, or forbid this, that, or the other. I think. Again, that's a bit outside my area of expertise. So I don't think that the president can quite intervene in the process, at least not directly. If he has a guy in the Justice Department, then maybe. But I don't think he does. So I don't think that's a threat at this point. There was some drama earlier about think his name is Rod Rosenstein, I want to say. And he's the guy in the Justice Department who technically heads the Mueller investigation into the alleged Russia collusion, such as it is, or such as it was. And there was some concern that he might have resigned because ostensibly a newspaper, I think the New York Times, came out with a story saying that he was the guy who had said that that he and other people in the administration might conspire to push the president out of office by using a provision of the U.S. Constitution that allows people in an administration to basically initiate a process that would remove the president predicated on his mental condition. So supposedly he had made some statements to that effect, that they might do that at some point. And that got him into trouble with Donald Trump, of course. So there was a conversation. He kind of called him in and talked to him. And so there was speculation that he might be fired or resign. Now, it's important whether he resigns or gets fired, because if he gets fired, then Congress basically has the choice of who to replace him. If he resigns, in that case, the president gets to replace him. So the concern was that if he resigned, then President Trump would be able to appoint somebody who was favorable to him, and would in turn, if that person were to take the job and pass the nominee and get past Congress, he doesn't need to get past Congress. That's the whole gist of it. But basically, if there's a pro-Trump guy in that position, he could disproportionately influence the investigation in a way that distorts the investigation in a way that kind of clears Trump of any possible allegations or indictment or what have you. Again, I'm not a lawyer. You can probably tell I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a strong legal background. This is just stuff that I've read. But that's an example of how the Justice Department is nominally independent of the White House when it comes to running investigations like this, unless they have a partisan guy kind of in charge of the investigation. As it happened, Rosenstein did not resign, so he's safe. So to speak, the investigation is not going to be subject to those concerns, such as they are.
April Fool's version. I saw a YouTube video on this one time, and that makes me an expert.
Yeah, that's we'll bring that up in April. We'll try our hand and see how badly we get burned. So let's see. That's roughly my impression. I'm sorry I can't really commit more to that to give you a more solid answer, but that's what I know off the top of my head. Or at least what I think I know off the top of my head. Again, I hope Cheat Chat is keeping me honest on this. How exactly does the ICCT work? How does their jurisdiction work? I'm going to assume that's a typo and it's supposed to be ICC, in which case it's the International something court, the International Criminal Court, I think. Let me check that. I don't want to steer you down the wrong path here. Probably not the International Cricket Council.
It could be.
It could be. Wow, there's a lot of ICCs in the world. International Criminal Court. I suspect that's the one they're referring to. Oh, that's right. There was that big John Bolton moment. That is his name, isn't it? I think I screwed up his name before. I don't want to do it again, so let's check that too. John Bolton. Yes, it is John Bolton. I think I called him Josh Bolton at some point in a previous episode. So let's see here. Basically, let me tell this anecdote and then I'll kind of get into the question a bit, because the anecdote does relate to the question. The International Criminal Court came out and said that there might be, what's the word I want? I think it was bring charges. They threatened to bring charges against Americans who had served in Afghanistan, who were alleged to have engaged in torture. So that triggered a lot of people in the Trump administration, especially John Bolton, who believe fervently in American sovereignty. Their whole governing philosophy in international relations is sovereignty overall. So they have a sort of predisposed dislike for international institutions that they perceive to be violating sovereignty. And the International Criminal Court is one of those. So they already didn't like the ICC, and they've been lobbying for that particular faction in U.S. politics have been lobbying for a long time to distance the United States as much as possible from international institutions like that. So generally that takes the form of trying to, writing op-eds or pressuring, whoever, bureaucrats or politicians or what have you, into adopting policies that are correspondent to that vision. It's pretty rare that they kind of get a battle that they can kind of fight, so to speak. So this was their moment. The ICC came out and actually threatened to press charges, file charges, so to speak, and I hope I'm getting that terminology right, but file charges against Americans. And so they finally got their moment to really come out and threaten the ICC, and they threatened to sanction people in the ICC, and they got to make this big, bold speech about how the ICC was violating American sovereignty, and America would always protect their own, etc., etc. It was basically their big damn heroes moment, so to speak. So they got to live their dream. That was their big outing. So that really kind of colors the American, that kind of gives you an idea of the American government's perspective on the ICC. So I suspect that might be the genesis for this question. So as for the ICC's jurisdiction, nominally it's the whole world, but really its jurisdiction only really extends to those countries that have signed on to it. So you have to sign, that's layman's terminology there. I don't know the technical terminology, but basically you have to sign on to be a part of the ICC in order to be subject to its jurisdiction. Again, I apologize for my legal cretinism there. I'm sure others can word that better. But yeah, nominally that's the case. I think technically the jurisdiction can expand to other areas, but the legality is a lot more dicey in that case. So I think Afghanistan is a signatory to the ICC. So I think that's sort of where the charges would come from if they were brought against those American personnel in question. But the ICC could not prosecute, say, crimes against humanity in the United States, should they occur, because the United States is not a part of the ICC. There is some argumentation that the ICC has universal jurisdiction, but I don't think that's technically been implemented yet. And if I'm wrong on that, I hope somebody corrects me. That is something that Spain has done. Spain actually has a court of human rights, I think it is, that claims to have universal jurisdiction. And so if human rights are violated anywhere in the world, technically you could go to a court in Spain and have that come to trial. And that, again, that's my understanding of it, but I believe that to be the case. So the ICC, I don't think, does that, at least not to that same degree. It doesn't have universal aspirations, per se. But I think there might be some attempt to interpret the law that way. Again, you can tell I'm not a lawyer, so that's my impression. That's about as much as I could commit to that. That's my understanding of the ICC's jurisdiction. I guess they also asked, how does the ICC work? So it is a judicial institution. It has a tiered system of courts, lower level of courts, sort of a medium level, and then there's a higher level at which the most difficult cases go. And I think it is broken up into regions, roughly. There are regional courts. But I think all of the court cases happen in Brussels, if I'm remembering correctly. So basically, charges are filed by prosecutors I think there are ICC prosecutors, I want to say, but I think they also take prosecutions from member states or member groups. That is to say, people who just live in those member states or NGOs or what have you. So they'll take those cases and then they'll arbitrate them, so to speak, or whatever the legal term for that would be, and then they'll make a ruling, and then it's kind of up to the member states to enforce that ruling. The ICC does not have the power to sanction states that ignore its ruling. In that sense, it's a very weak court system, and it's not that unusual for that to happen. It's not unusual for the ICC to basically subpoena this, that, or the other person, or request that this person be extradited, and to have that request basically go ignored. That's especially typical for Africa. There's a sense in Africa, even amongst those states that are signatories to the ICC, that the ICC discriminates against them, so to speak, that it unfairly focuses on crimes in Africa, but kind of glosses over similar crimes in other parts of the world. So there's a sense that the spotlight is kind of on them unfairly. So there's kind of a bad relationship there between a lot of African nations and the ICC for that reason. So that's a very rough outline of how the ICC works. I'm sure it must be more complicated than that, but that is my layman's understanding of it. Let's see. I hear a lot about trade wars with China on the market news. Has it produced any serious effects? Serious effects? Serious effects, specifically. It's kind of subjective in a sense. Because obviously, if you're losing your job because of tariffs or the trade war or what have you, that's pretty serious for you. For other people who are benefiting, not so much of a problem. So, kind of, it's subjective in that sense. There's definitely been economic fallout. A lot of industry, we had a guy send us an email, Neuro and I, basically talking about the impact on the metal trade, so to speak. Technically, the fence trade, fence production, fencing, so to speak. And so the impact has been deleterious there. But if you work in the steel industry, not necessarily that bad. You've seen an influx of investment dollars and a big uptick in demand for your product, at least within the United States. The serious effects, if they do come, have not really come yet. The impact has been relatively mitigated in the United States thus far. Trade has not really been significantly uprooted as of yet. There have been waves in the economy, but they've been pretty manageable thus far. Now, this is a big picture, macro kind of perspective. Again, individual case studies will vary dramatically depending on their relation to the goods and services that are being targeted. Probably more so goods at this point. But if expectations really change, that could preordain significant upturning in the trading relationship, which could have significant costs later down the line. I suspect at this point there is a expectation that eventually this kind of goes away or is significantly mitigated, that eventually either the Trump administration or itself or a new administration will come in and kind of walk back a lot of this trade conflict.
There's a question kind of related to this in the chat right now. Will iPhone prices go up further in the trade war?
Oh, I doubt it.
You doubt it?
No, because Apple makes has a ridiculously high profit margin on its iPhone. So it would not be terribly hard for it to eat that increase in costs. Keep in mind, a lot of the production of iPhones overseas comes from assembly, which does not add a significant value to the iPhone. A lot of the value added for iPhones comes from other countries in the region, not from China in particular. That's not to say that there are not Chinese firms that can't do that kind of work, and there are some Chinese firms that are doing more and more value-added type stuff, high value-added type production and manufacturing. But the iPhone in particular, I don't think really taps that. And in so much as it does, it would not be hard to shift that manufacturing elsewhere. That's what happened with solar panels. The United States put dumping duties on Chinese solar panels a long time ago. This is different than the solar tariffs that were implemented over the past year. Even under the Obama administration, if I'm remembering correctly, there were tariffs placed on Chinese exports of solar panels for dumping. And the result of that was that Chinese firms started moving their production around. They moved it out of China and started doing the base assembly in places like Thailand or Taiwan or Malaysia, what have you. And so every time they moved, the US government had to apply new tariffs on that particular country's exports. And so it was kind of a game of whack-a-mole in that sense. You know, the Chinese would just move production over and over again. I suspect if the trade war escalated such that costs became prohibitive for the iPhone in China, they would just move production someplace else, and that it would be a pretty simple matter for them. So even if things really came to a head, I suspect Apple would just shift production someplace else and maintain their low cost of production. Even if they, on the other hand, if they wanted to maintain production in China, they could probably relatively easily absorb the increase in cost in their profit margin. So for that reason, I don't think they would increase prices. I would argue it's already overpriced anyway, so it's not like you can jerk the price up too much more.
Well, it's kind of like buying fancy clothes. You're also paying for the name of the brand, as
Yeah, that's
opposed
the
to
thing
the base
about
of the product.
Yeah, that's the thing about Apple products. They're actually premium products. That's kind of high end, because they're basically charging you not for the cost of production, but for the brand. So they can charge, yeah, they can charge a lot more than an iPhone is actually worth because of the image of the iPhone, because of the product branding. And so they can get away with murder doing that. You know, I mean, the pricing is just ridiculous. You can save a lot of money by buying something else. I don't mean to shit on Apple here. I'm not saying it's a bad product. I'm just saying that a lot of the price is more branding than it is cost of production. So they have a lot of room to maneuver there if some part of their supply chain suddenly increases in costs. Would it be okay if I took a quick 2-minute break here? I need to feed the dog.
Go for it, dude. Dogs need to be fed.
So just a minute.
Okay. Yes, that was me. I took a moment to just tab out and just... Not even a really brutal ban or anything. Just a nice little... Hey, I see you there. Alright, streamer, I'm trolling you. Barp! You think you're the only one with this ability? Bum bum bum! I just went on to Twitch to troll somebody, but I got bamboozled. I don't know who I am anymore, or what year it is.
Sorry about that.
That was way faster than 2 minutes.
Oh, well, gotta give yourself a little room to maneuver. You never know what can go wrong.
I just imagined a tree falling through the roof. It's like, what? What could really go wrong here?
I don't know, slip on a banana peel, who's to say?
Oh my god. Speaking of the Nintendo universe, never mind.
Yeah, I meant to feed her before, but I got wrapped up trying to do a little last-minute research on something somebody brought up last week. They were asking about unfunded, specifically by the U.S. federal government, the U.S. federal government's unfunded liabilities. And I was a little cagey on my answer because I hadn't read about that in a while. And my impression was that under the Obama administration, and this isn't necessarily, I'm not attributing this to the Obama administration, but I thought it happened under the Obama administration, that changes and reforms had been implemented that had kind of dealt with that had kind of not fully covered the unfunded liabilities, but had kind of significantly pushed off into the distance the point at which they were a significant problem. So I went back and did some more research on that so I could give that person a better answer. I don't know if they're listening now or not. If so, I think I was thinking more about the deficit when I answered that question, because the deficit did fall under the Obama administration, technically, and I think a big part of that was increases in tax revenue from that top income bracket. So I think that's more what I was thinking of. So I've been off and on the past week, I've been trying to read more about unfunded liabilities so I can give this person a better, fuller answer. And it's proving a bit tricky. because some of the numbers that are thrown around are generated using very long-term projections. You know, $150 trillion, $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities over 75 years. And the trouble with long-term projections like that is that they're very sensitive to methodology. You know, it's very tricky to try to determine, you know, it's very tricky to figure out what certain variables will be in the medium to long term. And so the decisions you make on how to design those variables or construct them or etc., just how to construct the overarching methodology, that has a big impact in the final outcome of whatever it is you're trying to evaluate. So I've been trying to kind of wrap my head around that, and it's still very much a work in progress, because there's a lot to chew on there. I want to get into the methodology before I really commit to that answer, though, so I don't really have too much to report right now. But I'll try to have more, you know, next week once I kind of dig in more to the methodology. I've been reading more commentary in the vain hope that somebody could kind of succinctly describe the methodology for me, but it seems like I'm going to have to actually dig into some of the reporting there. There is an organization called the, what was it? I think I still got the link open. Something. Not OECD. Well, anyway, it's a organization that focuses specifically on Social Security policy in the United States, and they seem to be the principal group that people kind of reference. So they have a little report on their methodology, and I want to kind of dig into that a little bit to kind of understand how they came to their numbers and what the different competing models are and that kind of thing, so that I can kind of explain better just how you calculate unfunded liabilities over the long term, and then kind of give a judgment on roughly the health or illness, so to speak, of U.S. federal government's finances over that roughly 75-year period that people seem to use when making these projections. So long story short, that's why I didn't feed the dog. I got a little wrapped up into that and forgot. So my apologies, didn't mean to delay. So let's see, where were we? With the plethora of news coming from the U.S. political situation, it seems like a lot of attention is being pulled away from more important matters. There's still a large number of refugees trying to bury themselves in Djibouti. What are your thoughts? I don't think I've heard about a significant influx of refugees into Djibouti. So maybe I missed that. I apologize if so. But I don't think that's too much of an issue. I know you guys do love Djibouti.
I know. My first thought was, yep, they're just trolling. It sounded really funny when you said that, and I bet they knew that. That was planned.
Yeah, Djibouti is kind of the unofficial mascot country of the stream at this point.
Yes. They're already very amused, and it's only been a few moments.
Yeah, I think Djibouti is doing okay. Their refugee situation. If anything, they would be. If anything, there would be refugees coming from Djibouti, because I don't think refugees really see Djibouti as being a particularly attractive locale.
Do they not?
Well, yeah, basically, yeah. It's not. It's a stable country, but it's not a country with a whole lot of opportunities economically speaking. But it's stable enough that they don't really push out a lot of their own refugees either. Kind of middle of the road in that sense. So they're doing okay. I don't think the hearings on Cavanaugh or any of the other big political issues of the day are shifting attention from Djibouti. I'm sure they'll be okay. So let's see. I think I was reading some trivia. That's what it was. So some trivia on Djibouti, because I know you guys love hearing about it. So I'll just throw this out here. Djibouti is actually comprised of people who are basically ethnically Somali. And but unlike the rest of Somali territory, that particular area was colonized by the French. So originally it was called French Somaliland. And I might have brought this up before. I apologize if I'm being redundant. But basically, the other parts of Somalia had been British Somalia, and then the rest of it had been taken by the Italians, if I'm remembering correctly. And so basically, skip ahead, Britain ended up occupying almost all of it, except for French Somaliland. And so they gave Somalia a united Somalia, uniting the British and Italian colonized parts of Somalia into one unified Somalia in 1960. So then there was a question in French Somaliland about what the people there wanted to do. Did they want to become part of Somalia, or did they want to become independent, or did they want to remain a French colony? So there was a vote, and it was kind of inconclusive. Basically, they voted for the status quo, but there was still a lot of agitation for independence. So then there was another vote in the late 1970s, and it was in the 1970s that they voted to become independent. Now, there's a caveat there, because there are accusations that the French threw that vote, because leading up to the vote, several thousands of tribespeople were expelled from the country. And a lot of those people probably would have been pro-independence. Also controversial, Europeans living in French Somaliland at the time were also allowed to vote in that referendum. So this was not exclusively ethnic Somalis who were participating. So some shady business there, but ultimately the pro-independence forces worked out, and French Somaliland did not become a part of Somalia. They maintained their independence, which was the favored outcome of the French government, which still wanted to kind of maintain close ties to that territory, which they still do to this day, I might add. Kind of worked out, because obviously Somalia had some problems around 1990, and has continued to have those problems. So Djibouti has managed to avoid those problems by way of becoming independent and maintaining its status as a separate polity from the rest of Somalia, or from the rest of Somali territory, rather. So that's a little background history to chat's favorite country there.
Nice.
So let's see. I'll do something. Where were we? Oh, right. Okay, could you talk about historical development of the U.S. federal income tax, please? And if possible, also shine some light onto state and local income tax. Why do some states don't have them? What can they be used for? How are state and local taxes changed? Thank you. Okay. Technical question. These are always fun. So, roughly off the top of my head, from memory, the U.S. did not have a federal income tax until, I want to say, 1915, roughly. Maybe it was after that. Maybe it was around more after. Basically, the only reason the U.S. implemented the income tax it has now, anyway. I don't think there was an income tax before that, but I might be wrong. Hope maybe some historian in chat can kind of correct me on that. But the federal income tax that we have now originated from World War I. The government needed to raise a lot of revenue for the war effort, so the income tax was passed. And originally, it was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be a temporary tax to pay for the war, and then it was supposed to kind of go away. Well, that didn't happen. It stuck around. That revenue was very attractive to the federal government, and they found new uses for it after the war ended. So it never quite went away. That's my understanding. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong. So that's roughly the genesis of the U.S. federal income tax. Beyond that, there's a lot of ebb and flow between how the tax is set, how high it is, which income brackets it targets. I don't know enough of that history to kind of give you a fully fleshed out, history of how the federal income tax has changed with time. Roughly, it has not really changed in principle. It's always been, X percentage of your income. Some interesting trivia that I found interesting. People talk about marginal tax rates, and that can be a little bit confusing. So I thought maybe it would be useful if I kind of teased that out a little bit, and maybe I'll even get this wrong. Definitely, please correct me on this if I'm wrong, because I think I finally kind of got this. But basically, uh, the different tax brackets apply to your income differently. So it's not as though if you make $100 million, let's say, that you're going to pay that top bracket on all of that $100 million. Basically, the first, let's say, $30,000 you make is subject to that lowest tax bracket. I'm assuming that the lowest tax bracket is $30,000 or below. So you'll pay, whatever, 10% on that. So then, whatever the next bracket is, from $30,000 to $50,000, let's say, that portion, that amount of money that you made is going to be subject to that tax rate. So then it scales up accordingly. So if you make $100 million, the first, let's say $200,000 of that you're going to pay different tax rates on that depending on where that $200,000 falls on the tax bracket. The rest of that money is what you paid that highest tax rate for. So that's what people are referring to when they talk about marginal tax rates, at least in so much as they're referring to federal income taxes. That's my understanding. So it's a little bit of a tricky concept. So I thought maybe it would be useful for people to hear that. Again, if I'm wrong, please correct me, because that's something I've struggled with off and on again with over time. So definitely help me out there if you can. But if that is accurate, some useful info for you. But as for the historical development of the federal income tax, I can't really give you a whole lot of detail there. It hasn't really changed in principle over time. It's only really changed in its scale, at least as far as I know. Let's see, and if possible, also shine light onto state and local income taxes. Specifically, why do some states have them and some not? That's a political question. There are some states where the predominant politics of the state are just dead against a income tax. An income tax has always been pretty controversial. Here in the United States, the IRS, which is the United States government's collection bureaucracy, basically, the Internal Revenue Service is what that stands for. They're the bureaucracy that's responsible. They're the agency, I should say, that's responsible for collecting people's taxes and performing audits of people's taxes. They are not well liked, often with good reason. There are some abuses and some chicanery there, but overall, the impression is not positive. People resent high taxes in the United States, especially conservative parts of the United States. So very conservative states like Texas, a lot of southern states and western states do not have state income taxes because of political opposition.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, that's people are very gung-ho about that here. So that's why it basically comes down to politics. There is, I guess I could go into a little bit of the history there. Basically, states that have historically had more industrialization tend to be the states that have income taxes. So that's just kind of the way the socio-economic evolution of those states panned out. Basically, when they industrialized, they attracted a lot of industrial, low-wage, blue-collar workers, and a lot of those people tended to be political left, at least in so much as that meant being pro-labor. And so those places were much more politically in favor of income taxes because those taxes could be used to pay for sundry pro-labor benefits policy of one sort or another. So states like New York, California, probably certain of the Midwestern states, they tend to be more the states that are more likely to have income taxes, and if not also higher income taxes. In turn, states that have historically been more rural, more agricultural, like the South or like the West, tend to be more conservative and in turn tend to be more inimical. That's going to drive me batshit because that was bugging me last week too.
Amicable?
Amicable is pro. That's when you support something. That's something that is basically dovetails with your interests. What is the opposite of amicable?
Adversarial?
Not quite. This is probably driving chat crazy.
There was a nice comment in the chat saying that taxation is theft. And one thing that I would like to kind of remind people of in the historical capacity is why taxes would be paid to a lord. If you go back like medieval level shit, I think that gives a better perspective of what taxes are for. And it's the basic relationship between a farmer and bandits, if I could take a stab at this. And that is, a farmer, sure, maybe you have a sword, and if a man comes to your home and attacks your family, you can get your sword and you can defend yourself. But if some bandits show up and it's like 6 of them, it doesn't matter how big your sword is, you're done. Your family is going to give up whatever valuables it has. You're going to be in the hole and it's going to be a bad year for you. But if you have a lord, someone who's kind of in charge of the monopoly on violence in your region, you can pay him what's effectively insurance or also just straight up defense. So if the bandits show up at your place, you say, hey, there are these bandits, they took this stuff from me, and I pay you taxes, go do something about it. And it ends up being a sort of symbiotic relationship where if the Lord never has to defend you, some people might say, well, we're just paying him and he doesn't do anything for us. But you also kind of pay for the protection in that the bandits are less likely to attack you if they know that you are backed by someone with a standing army. So that's kind of the basics of taxes. You also have like road building and infrastructure and stuff like that, but I feel like the bandit-farmer relationship is more of the foundation for why you would pay someone money at intervals, just because.
Yeah, that is kind of the historical civilizational origin of taxes. A good summary. So for those who care, I apologize. The word is inimical.
Inimical.
Inimical, yes, that's the word I was looking
Like
for.
enemy.
Quite
Inimical.
kind of. It's actually spelled with an I, so it's inimical. Inimical. I always get tongue twisted. I always get tongue twisted over it. Let's see. So yeah, that's roughly an explanation of why some states have income taxes and some don't. Let's see. So the next bit of the question was what can they be used for? How are state? So getting into what state and local taxes are used for, that kind of gets into sort of the political structure of the United States. States have the power over broad swaths of the economy in their state. There's economic You can regulate your insurance industry differently. You can regulate companies differently. You can do a lot of different things at the state level. The federal government can also do that, and generally, the federal government kind of trumps the state level. But hypothetically, the way the Constitution is written is supposed to prevent overlap like that. Nominally, whatever powers the federal powers of regulation the feds have are not supposed to be had by the states, and vice versa. In practice, that's not really how it works. You know, in practice, there's been some fudging over time that has given the federal government more and more regulatory power over state economies. But that's kind of a push-pull thing. That's a constant battle in Washington, into which they can do that. If you're interested in that, you can look into the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, because that's been warped and bent and reinterpreted many times over the course of U.S. history to justify this, that, or the other regulation at the federal level. That's a whole debate in and of itself. So what can they be used for? Basically, any state and local taxes can be used for anything that is within the remit of state or local political power to deal with, to have power over. How are state and local taxes changed? It depends on the state and the locale. Most localities do not themselves have income taxes, and this question seems to be geared specifically towards income taxes. But in places that don't have income taxes, generally localities or even states will depend on some combination of sales taxes and property taxes. And the way they are changed is generally by the legislature in question, of whatever polity is you're referring to. For a city or a town, it'll probably be the city council. If it's a lower level than that, it might be the county. If you're talking state, then it'll be the state legislature. So generally, those are the political forces responsible for setting and or changing tax laws. So I think that pretty much covers the different angles here. If I'm missing an element, please feel free to ask again, and I can kind of focus on what I'm missing here. But I think I've kind of covered the ambit of this one. Let's see, what is your take on the whole Elon Musk Tesla SEC ordeal that just went on? How do you think this will likely affect Tesla in a business standpoint now that Musk will not be an acting executive?
No, he's still an executive. He's not the chairman. He's just CEO.
There you go.
So I saw this a little bit. It was less entertaining for me because this is kind of just like he was silly on Twitter and he's getting slapped for it. The TLDR, he was making a joke saying that Tesla stock was going to be traded at $420, and 420 is the weed number. And apparently that was supposed to be a fun joke for his girlfriend. And this is sort of a way of saying, no, you can't really joke about that stuff because people actually accept that as fact. They're not necessarily going to know that you're trying to make a weed joke. So now you're in trouble. And this is also kind of off the back of some other sort of questionable stuff that Musk has done. He seems like a guy who works really hard and he has a lot of ideas and might push himself a little bit too much, which could impact his inhibitions. Just, maybe this is stupid, I shouldn't do this. If you're really tired, sometimes you just do it anyway and you don't give a shit. And he's built quite an empire around himself with Tesla and SpaceX and stuff like that. So this should be a little wake-up call for him, I think.
Yeah, the way financial institutions and the financial industry is regulated in the United States, basically there is a different bar for people in positions of power. So if you're just some random guy, then you would have no problem from the SEC making jokes like that. But if you are in a position where your words carry greater weight in finance, like say if you're the CEO of a major corporation,
or several,
then the SEC will hold you to a higher bar. You know, there's a higher account. So if you do say something like that, they're gonna hammer you for sure. You know, a lot of people lost a lot of money after those comments, so it was not like a small thing. It was a significant sum of money because a lot of people had been shorting Tesla stock up to that point, and still are really. But because the stock went up significantly in value, a lot of those people lost money. So those people kind of saw it as a deliberate attack on them. If you are someone who shorts Tesla stock, then a statement like that could have been perceived as a conspiracy to try to damage you as a kind of revenge. There's not a few people who perceive shorting a stock as a kind of insult, as a kind of conspiracy to try to destroy the value of the stock and destroy the company. And those people get very catty. And so it seems like Elon Musk might have fallen into that category. He might have made some catty comments basically directed at short sellers that ended up costing them a lot of money in real terms. And so for that reason, that's why the SEC is getting involved. If he wants to shit on short sellers and if he wants to shit on, just anybody or make stupid jokes, for the benefit of his girlfriend, he can do that. But he can't do it in a way that violates the power that has been entrusted to him as a corporate leader. There's even, to kind of elaborate on that, there is within the field of investment such a thing as institutional investors. And these are significant, large, major investing entities, generally corporations, generally banks of one sort or another. And once they reach a sufficient size, then financial regulators assume that they have the professionalism and expertise to take on risk where they see fit. So they can do things that regular people, so to speak, cannot do. There are some financial products and some investments that regular average Joes cannot make or participate in because it is not assumed by the SEC that they have the expertise to engage in that kind of trade without taking on undue risk or without being exploited. So there is, in that sense, kind of a double standard in financial regulation, where there's one set of rules for the people on top, the banks, the again, the institutional investors and the people on the bottom, sort of the retail investors, who are not assumed to be sufficiently savvy to really compete in a fully competitive financial market. So there are some restrictions there that are put in place to protect retail investors to a degree from their own ignorance, and then to a degree from predatory investors of one sort or another. So that gives you an idea of the different sets of rules that are created and used in financial regulation and applied to people differently. Elon Musk obviously falls into the special category, basically, of people who are held to a higher standard. So that's why he's kind of getting the hammer dropped on him. So those are thoughts on that.
I like the comments related to all this saying he works way too hard. He just needs to take 2 weeks off. Just straight up. Not even like a strategy meeting or whatever. It's just managing multiple huge companies and being a public face and also being a CEO of all this and this and this and this. Just take a rest. Go to an island, have a beverage, sit in the sun, just be cool, regather yourself, and then go at it.
Yeah, maybe you ought to hang out with Joe Rogan more.
Did we talk about that last week? I think we touched on it.
We might have touched on it a little bit. I don't quite recall. It was pretty funny, though.
It may have been that people just asked me about it. I kind of skimmed through it. It didn't really captivate my interest or whatever. I'm not really a fan of either of them, but I'm aware that both of them have a pretty large set of people who really respect them and like them. Yeah, it was pretty funny because the atmosphere was very much like a casual, just two individuals smoking some herb and shooting the shit, which a lot of people can relate to that social format. And then seeing Musk in that situation was kind of like, wait, what? They think of it as kind of unprofessional, but it was California, so technically they were not breaking the law, and they did say words at each other.
There might have been a problem with federal law, because apparently some of his companies have contracts with the federal government. And apparently there are certain requirements that people involved in those contracts adhere to certain standards that may or may not involve marijuana usage. I don't recall if that went anywhere. I haven't heard about it since, so I assume not. But there was that question kind of raised. Beyond just being in California, where it is definitely legal, there are, being a federal contractor with the government brings certain extra obligations.
Yeah. And if I could hazard to guess, I would say that Musk is the kind of guy who thinks that he is a big boss and he can do whatever he wants. So he's more willing to push the line rather than play it safe. And he knows that he has a lot of pull in different areas, so it's like, what are you really going to do? What are you really going to do about this? You'll be upset? Okay, I don't care. Maybe he even likes that. I hope people get a little bit upset from this.
Could be. Yeah. We have an old saying here in the United States: never do business with the government. That's deeply rooted. It's very difficult, if you have a dispute in a business contract with the government, to win that dispute. But the government obviously has disproportionate access to resources, both financial and legal. So that's a very difficult battle to win if you do end up in it. So that's that's perceived as a risky endeavor, depending on the nature of the contract in question. Let's see, it follows up. I think I read that penalties would be much worse if Musk didn't choose to settle. What would those be? I don't know. I haven't read a whole lot about the whole Musk issue. I don't really know what penalties he's at risk of suffering. I think I did read that he's not going to be CEO going forward, and he'll still remain on the board of directors.
I thought it was the opposite. He's not going to be chairman, but he is going to be CEO. Unless that changed from what I read.
Let me see. That's a good question. It's a good point.
And for people who don't know, I thought this was a really nice analogy. I saw this in a Reddit thread. It was talking about the difference between chairman and CEO, because it's just technical terms, like what does that actually mean? The CEO is like the coach of the team, where they're the one who is the highest level employee. They're the public face, and they're kind of making sure the team is doing what it's supposed to do. Whereas the chairman is kind of like more in the team ownership role, where they're looking at the direction the team is going and trying to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. So
That's a very good summary. Yeah, right on the dot.
yeah, well,
Wait, not on the dot.
I took it from Reddit. I didn't come up with that myself.
On the nose. I think that's the phrase I wanted. Wait, no.
Turn on. You just turned on a dime, didn't you, Neuro?
I'm sorry, my colloquialisms are not really coming out right tonight. Try to cut back. Yeah, you're right. He is going to step down as chairman of Tesla, but remain CEO. Thank you for correcting me. Yeah, board of directors play a very important role in governing, in corporate governance, so to speak. Generally, it's kind of more on them to determine the direction of a company and to kind of either leash or unleash the CEO to do or not do a given program or take a given action. There's not... People kind of focus on the CEO because they're generally the face of the company, but really more attention ought to be placed on the board of directors since they're the ones who are technically responsible for policing a given CEO. So one of the big criticisms of corporate governance in the United States has been that boards of directors are a little too chummy with CEOs. They're kind of part of the same little in-group, the same clique. And so they tend to take it easy on CEOs, give them sweetheart deals, etc. They have not really... The criticism is that boards of directors in the United States do not invest enough in their role as, how should I say, governors, so to speak, of the corporation. As a... Oh man, blanking out again. But you get the idea. Basically, that's their role, and they haven't really been as good at it as they should be. That's the kind of thing, though, that you can change with by changing the corporate charter. Because if you are a significant shareholder, you can vote on who gets to be on the board of directors. I believe that. I guess that would depend on the corporate charter in question, but technically that's generally the way it works. So shareholders can kind of band together and vote this, that, or the other guy out of board of directors if they so chose. So nominally, if a corporate charter is problematic in some way, or if the board of directors is not doing their job, you can vote for changes to try to have that be alleviated, fix that. In practice, that can be sometimes difficult, though, because corporate charters are sometimes engineered in a way specifically to make that difficult. Again, depends on the company in question. So let's see. So basically, the answer to this question is I don't really know. I don't really know what other I don't really know what other penalties he's at risk of suffering if he does not settle. So I'm sorry, that's not a great answer.
I was going to say, and for this year's the most long-winded answer to I Don't Know Awards, we have Agent Smith.
Yeah, I can drag him out.
I think it's fun. It's kind of like saying, to give an analogy, someone's asking where the treasure is in the woods. And you don't know exactly where it is, but you know kind of roughly the general area, and you kind of narrow it down for them. You didn't tell them where the treasure is, but it was a clue. And they can take that for what it is. So, they got some clues. They can be happy. Djibouti.
All right, let's see. It seems to me that it's much harder for people to work at the same job their whole lives. Do you think a new approach is needed to support re-educating people with a safety net of sorts when their jobs disappear? I would definitely agree that that model of that sort of economic model where you work at the same company forever, that's definitely on the way out, if it's not gone already. You know, most people now kind of change jobs, hop from job to job with company to company. Kukio did that back in the day. He had several different jobs with a couple. Well, it was the same kind of job, but it was different companies. He was jumping from firm to firm, taking advantage of opportunities as they arose. So that's definitely kind of the norm, it would seem, going to be the norm going forward. Now, what do you do about that is a subjective question. Different people will have different preferences there. One thing you could do is to expend government resources trying to imbue people, educate people with new skills such that they're able to change tack, change profession, change industry, should they need to. You know, in the case one career path ends up being blocked because that industry collapses or because it's oversaturated or whatever, they would have as an option that government service to try to change industry. That's one way you could do it. I'm not sure what other alternatives there are really beyond taking a greater role in trying more in education early in people's lives to try to inculcate them with the new status quo's values and try to get them familiar with that so that they can make better, more informed decisions about what career path they want to endeavor on when they're very young. But basically, whether or not you want to actively do something about it is purely subjective. People can kind of decide, people have to decide on that for themselves, what the role of government should be in responding to that issue. And I'm sure any number of policy outfits have their own prescriptions for that. I'm sure there's free market and government solutions there, but I don't, off the top of my head, I'm struggling to remember them. But I wouldn't make a judgment one way or the other. That's more just up to you. I would like to give policy prescriptions there just to give a range of options, but I'm struggling. I can't quite remember, so I'm sorry. That's not particularly satisfying. I think trade school was one option. So some people were talking about having a system, kind of like Europe. We were talking a bit about this last week. Having a system more like Europe's system of gymnasiums, where you have kids choose whether they want to go to university or whether they want to go to basically a trade school. And so then that kind of gives them more of an option. So then they have a what would you call it? A backup skill, basically. So even if they don't necessarily go into that industry after they graduate, they kind of have that to fall back on, whatever they end up doing, regardless of what they end up doing. If later on, you could argue, the counter argument there is, well, what if you go do that thing and then later on you can't do it? You have to change industry. What are your resources then? There's already some programs like that. The Midwest has a lot of trade adjustment programs. I think the federal government even has a trade adjustment program that is meant to provide assistance to people who have been displaced because of free trade and who need resources or want resources to educate themselves in a new skill. So there's already some programs that are like that in place. The effectiveness is a little mixed, though. There's a lot of people who don't take them up, and the people who do take them up often don't really end up with positive outcomes. So the record is mixed on those. So whether or not you want to do them just comes down to whether or not you want those resources to be available or not. What the most effective policy would be, I don't know. I would have to read the literature on the subject to really get familiar with that. Interesting question, though, but yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. Anywho, let's see. Do you foresee Hong Kong/China border situation escalating in the short term? There's lots of evidence that China is taking many steps to permeate the border far ahead of the 2047 merger, and Hong Kong citizens are worried the agreement will be reneged. It's going to be reneged, for sure. There's no obligation on the part of the Chinese government to maintain Hong Kong's current form of government beyond the 50-year point agreed at the 1997 handover. Actually, it was agreed to before that, but the clock started running at 1997. So after that, China can do whatever the hell it wants. So there's really not much disincentive to stop them from changing Hong Kong's form of government after that. But to get back to the first part of the question, do I foresee the border situation escalating in the short term? I doubt it. I would doubt it. I think this person is partly referring to the new train line. I think that's what it was. A new train line was built connecting Hong Kong directly to the mainland. Well, when I say Hong Kong, I mean specifically the city. The reason it's significant is because Chinese police are going to be responsible for policing the train line and train stations, which means that mainland Chinese police will be in Hong Kong itself and will have some jurisdiction there. It's only a train station, but that's still something. And that was not the case before. Before it had been only Hong Kong police in Hong Kong itself. There had been no mainland police, so to speak, except for the ones that kidnapped people, but that's a whole other that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, that's kind of the crux of the issue. That's where the concern is coming from. This is seen as sort of, there are some critics who believe this to be the thin end of the wedge, so to speak, and are concerned it may presage further expansions of mainland police jurisdiction in Hong Kong in future. But I don't know that there's a lot Hong Kong can really do about it. I mean, for one, the Hong Kong government is on board with it, so it's legal. So they can't really go into the courts and complain about it. There could be unrest and protest, but I don't think those would be any more effective than any of the previous protests and really instigating significant change there. So in that sense, I don't think there will be any significant escalation in the short term. There might be some protests, but I don't think anybody can do anything about it. I think for the most part, the public in Hong Kong kind of just accepts that that station is going to be built and that mainland police will have jurisdiction there. If there were further expansion that really challenged the status quo, that could be different. That might presage significant unrest. But that's uncertain. You know, it's unclear if that would actually pan out that way or not. It may be that if the Chinese government really made a power move to take more power in Hong Kong, that the public would kind of accept it, that they would have not a lot of choice in the matter. You know, the Communist Party of China has all the high cards there, because I'm pretty sure nobody outside China is really going to go to bat for Hong Kong at this point. There's just not enough leverage that can be brought to bear for what is going to be perceived by the Communist Party of China as an internal issue, as a sovereign, that is an issue of sovereignty, basically. You know, any challenge would be perceived as a challenge to the sovereignty of China, if not the territorial integrity of China. I think they also banned the Hong Kong Independence Party recently. It wasn't very big, but they had one. And it was disconcerting for the authorities in both Hong Kong and the mainland. So finally, they kind of banned them outright. But yeah, I just don't see that panning out any other way than kind of the trajectory it's already on. You know, barring some change in heart by the Communist Party of China itself at some point before 2047, I don't think there's much they can do. I mean, they can try to have an uprising, they can try to overthrow the party or their current government, but all that does is give the PLA an excuse to roll in and deal with them, and then settle the issue permanently. And again, there's just not much anybody outside China would be able to do to help them. So, kind of the same problem as Tibet and Xinjiang. You know, as bad as the situation may or may not be, there's just flip all anybody outside China can really do about it. China is too strong, and there's too little leverage that other powers could exert to really change policy in those places. So that's roughly my perspective on that issue. Not great news if you're from Hong Kong, but you know, it is what it is. It could be interesting if it probably won't happen, but an interesting possibility is that China might hand Hong Kong over to Taiwan. Since technically it's all one China, so technically it shouldn't really matter in that sense if Hong Kong were made part of Taiwan. But I think for one, obviously the Chinese government doesn't want to do that, because for them, it's all sovereign Chinese territory, and they don't want to have more territory be in the hands of what they consider to be a breakaway province. But more to the point, Taiwan itself may not accept such an arrangement because it might imply that Taiwan were a part of China. And there are a lot of people in Taiwan who don't like that, who want to be independent, and so who would not agree necessarily to something that would have as a corresponding implication that there should at some point be a unified single China. So if only for that political reason, Taiwan itself may reject such an arrangement. But hypothetically, that is a possibility. That might be a way in which Hong Kong could preserve its form of government beyond the 2047 end date. I doubt it, but hypothetical possibility. Just kind of ballparking it. Let's see, so then, do you see any interesting trends with renewable energy? Do you see anyone adopting it disproportionately to other nations/regions? And do you see any impact yet on shifting markets towards solar, wind, etc.? and away from coal and fossil fuels. So I would reiterate what I've said before with regard to these kinds of questions. I'm not a environmental policy guy, so this isn't really my area. But I'm trying to think if I've read anything about certain countries that have kind of invested more in it than others. China's kind of the first country that comes to mind, because the Chinese government pretty explicitly has an industrial policy, and part of that industrial policy is developing clean energy industries. So they've gone to bat to try to dump a lot of money and investment into those industries to try to develop them. And I think we were talking a week or two ago about how the Chinese government pulled subsidies, or supports rather, for their solar industry because so much capacity was being built in the wrong places. So the industry is relatively healthy. But basically that speaks to how large the industry is in China. Not just the solar industry, but also the green energy industry writ large in China. So China is one example. I don't think they're at the point yet where they're completely self-sufficient in terms of how much of their energy they get from clean energy, but they've definitely dumped a lot of resources into it and are kind of getting there. I think they're supposed to kind of get there within by 2030 or 2040 or something. Let me think. Nobody else is really coming to mind. I've read of various projects in individual countries that are pushing clean energy, but I can't think of anybody who's really going full tilt. Who's really making that, who has made significant process and a significant policy commitment, both at the same time. There is a province in eastern India called Assam, and I believe it has shifted fully to renewable energy. I think. I hope I'm remembering that correctly.
One theme that we've talked about a lot, not just for energy use, but changes in general, like big changes, is it's going to be the easiest to facilitate the smaller the group, the smaller the country, the smaller the region. So you should see maybe some of the smaller Western European countries, or maybe a state in the US or something. I think there are a couple cities that have gone full renewable, but it's more in those small cases, and then we can scale it up once the smaller test cases turn out to be a good bet.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. You know, California is an example of that here in the US. You know, they've been much more gung-ho about trying to green their energy sector, so to speak. So California, probably some of the northeastern states here in the US. I was about to say Ontario, but that's not quite accurate. they've got that Ford guy up there. He's a very colorful figure. Do you remember the mayor of Toronto who got caught smoking crack?
No.
Oh. Okay. Well, this will be an interesting story for you then. There was a guy, I think his name was Rob Ford, and he was basically a kind of populist candidate, you know, rent is too damn high, he was more of a conservative populist there. He wanted lower taxes, that kind of thing. And he was a very colorful, eccentric figure. And he ran for the office of mayor of Toronto and won. And his whole term in office was just very hectic and very similar to Donald Trump's period in office in a lot of ways. You know, he kind of had a big mouth. He was very bombastic. You know, he was very pushy. You know, he really pushed his policy preferences hard in government. So he was that kind of politician. And then kind of out of the blue, one day, and I don't remember the time frame, I want to say like around 2010 or something. You know, maybe some Canadians can kind of correct me on that. But there was some, I believe it was photos. I can't remember if it was photos or video footage, but he was at a house with some people. I don't remember what their relation to him was, but they actually just showed him smoking crack. Like, full stop. Like, there's no way you can disprove it. It's literally just him smoking crack. And so then there was sort of this big kerfuffle in Ontario about what to do about that. Like, oh, the mayor of Toronto has smoked crack, and we have verifiable proof of that. Where do we go from here? I don't think he was pushed out of office, but I don't think he was reelected either. There was some considerable fallout from that. So he died, I think.
Yep, we have someone, Musk Neotech even said that he's dead.
Yeah, he passed away. And I don't remember what the cause was. I don't remember if it was natural causes or a drug overdose. But he passed away a few years ago. And right now, his brother is actually governor of Ontario. His brother ran on a very similar platform and has a very similar style of politics. He ran for governor. Well, it's actually not governor, isn't it? You guys have another word for that in Canada, but basically he's governor of Ontario. He won that office, and so Ontario is not quite the policy in Ontario is not quite on the same track as places like California, etc., that are really heavily emphasizing clean energy and greening of the territory. But I'm sure they've had some programs in that vein in the past.
They said maybe premier, not governor.
Thank you, premier. Premier of the province. You guys and your Britishisms. You should have broken away when you had the chance. Yeah. Actually, that's some interesting trivia. Maybe some people would be interested in that. Why didn't Canada break away when the 13 American colonies did during the Revolutionary War?
Ooh, nostalgia.
Well, some of that. Everybody in the colonies at the time, the 13 colonies and what would become the British colonies and in the Caribbean, they were all British citizens. They all thought of themselves as British. So when the 13 colonies broke away, that was basically treason. Even they themselves, the founding fathers, so to speak, of the United States, had not originally really wanted to leave. They had wanted compromise. They just didn't perceive the British government to be willing to give that to them. So they said, screw it, we're just going to leave and make our own rules from now on. We're going to make our own country, and then you can buzz off. Not everybody felt that the differences with Britain were so great, and that the ostensible mismanagement of colonial administrators was so egregious that a civil war was warranted. Hence, places like what would become Canada, I think at that time it was Hudson Bay Colony, and the Caribbean colonies, and actually Florida, which at that time was also a British colony, all of them refused to participate in the Civil War. They did not side with the 13 colonies. Hypothetically, they could have, and the United States could have been significantly larger upon its inception, but they didn't. In fact, not even Quebec sided with the 13 colonies. In fact, there was an attempt by the revolutionaries at the time to invade Quebec because it was assumed that the French Canadians there would relish the chance to break away from the British and either join the 13 colonies or become independent. That did not pan out. As it happened, the people of Quebec at that time were content with British rule. They weren't really happy with it. There were problems. There was discrimination. But they didn't particularly get along with the colonists in the 13 colonies either. Those were kind of seen as competitors for that same western frontier space, which, mind you, the British government had originally given to Quebec. One of the contributing factors to the Revolutionary War was that a lot of frontier territory was, one, explicitly identified as Indian territory that was not to be colonized, and two, other areas identified specifically as belonging to Quebecois, and that would be settled by Quebecois. Colonists...
Quebecois.
Sorry? Quebecois, thank you. Colonists east of the Appalachians did not like that one bit, because they thought that that was land that they would settle, that they could buy and speculate on and profit from, etc. And so that created a lot of ill will with the British government in and of itself. Now, that wasn't the contributing factor, but it was a significant contributing factor. And it was that rivalry that kind of led to that unwillingness on the part of the people of Quebec to side with the colonists and help them out when they invaded. As was the revolutionary invasion of Quebec was a complete disaster, and they were rebuffed completely by the British and local militia. They weren't called Canadians at that time, but that's basically what they were, Canadian militia. So that roughly is why those other territories did not join in. That's why we only had 13 colonies when the United States became independent, and not 15 or 16 or however many colonies there were at the time. There was some reluctance in the South too, because a lot of Southerners benefited from free trade. They did not really have much. They did not necessarily have a whole lot to gain per se by becoming independent, because for them they imported finished goods and exported raw materials, basically cotton, principally. Well,
Are you saying
tobacco.
finished goods as in completed goods or as in from Finland?
Completed goods.
Okay.
Finished goods as in completed goods.
Okay, just need to know, because Finland is very famous now.
It is that. Thank you again for the hockey players, Finland. Much appreciated.
And perhaps the best StarCraft player in the world.
There you go. More to it. Keep it up, guys. we need your talent. But let's see. Yeah, finished goods and also merchant trade. A lot of the economy in the northeastern U.S. and the mid-Atlantic states, or colonies rather, was merchant trade. And merchant traders did not like a lot of the restrictions that were placed on them by the British colonial government. In the South, though, they didn't really rely a lot on merchant trade, so they didn't really give that much of a shit. So they were always a little bit ambivalent about breaking away. Ultimately, they went along with it because they valued self-government. And they also did not like some of the tariffs that were being placed on goods that were imported from places besides Britain. But they were a little bit cagey in that sense. So the 13 colonies becoming independent was never a sure thing. It was a very dicey affair. It really was more of a civil war between British people than it was, Americans versus British, per se. There were a lot of loyalists in the colonies at the time, within the 13 colonies, that sided with the British and ended up getting basically purged. A significant chunk of the early population of Ontario was actually comprised of Americans who had been dislocated from the colonies by the war. In fact, I think I remember there's some groups who are descended, modern day groups who are comprised of descendants from Americans who were dislocated by that war. And I remember reading a particularly disgruntled interpretation of the Revolutionary War from the perspective of a loyalist who had been forced to flee. Very different perspective, very interesting to say the least. But anyway, that's a little Canadian tangent for you.
Well, we got a host from a Canadian streamer, so tonight was a good night to do that.
Nice. Let's see, we did Hong Kong, renewable. Yeah, I just can't think of a whole lot of good case studies for that. Like which countries have really invested a lot in clean energy policies. Countries adopting it disproportionately to other nations. If I had to guess, I would say the developed world is probably focusing more on it just because they have more resources to work with. There are a lot of developing countries that would like to make that shift for reasons of self-sufficiency or security over the long term or what have you, or just economic development reasons. But they just don't really quite have the same resources to work with to make it happen. So it's a little more tricky for them. So let's see. Is the USA good for an immigrant industrial engineer? I would highly recommend you consult somebody with a background in your specific industry. Preferably somebody with experience immigrating to the US. I myself cannot really answer that with confidence.
Born and raised.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if you are thinking about immigrating to the United States to take a job as an industrial engineer, I would recommend rather that you look into the corresponding industry in the US to see what the health of the industry is and what legal hoops you would have to jump through in order to get a job, to get what would probably be an H-1B visa working here in the US. Or whatever means you need to get through to get here. But I myself can't really gauge just how furtive the job opportunities are for somebody with a background in industrial engineering. Yeah, that's really a very specific question beyond my remit. Let's see. Trump often says that other countries like Mexico and Canada are ripping the USA off with unfair tariffs, claiming USA is not getting a fair trade and is being ripped off. Is this true? Well, that's kind of subjective. That's subjective judgment, because it depends on how you define being ripped off. Let me see if I can remember the crux of the argumentation there. Basically, the argument against trade with Mexico, Canada, is that NAFTA was structured in a way that incentivized and facilitated the mass relocation of heavy industry away from the United States, and in turn resulted in a corresponding significant drop in employment in those industries. And in turn, there are fewer job opportunities for future generations who might have worked in those industries. So in that sense, you could say the US was ripped off. Because a lot of people before NAFTA had passed and was implemented had cautioned that that could happen. That there could be a, well, to borrow the colorful phrase of Ross Perot, there could be a quote-unquote giant sucking sound of jobs leaving the United States. That's a little gem from the 1992 presidential election. I think it was 92 anyway. Basically, Ross Perot ran against George H.W. Bush, ran against Bill Clinton. It was a three-way race. I think that's okay. Anyway, that's the argumentation against NAFTA, roughly. There's also accusations about, cheap labor in Mexico and the Canadians not giving access to their dairy market. Those little things like that. But the crux of it really comes down to heavy industry, and the automobile industry in particular. Now, the counter-argument is that the United States has benefited immensely from the agreement. Yes, there were a number of jobs and factories that were relocated, but in turn, there were jobs gained from selling to Mexico and Canada. New access and more open access to those markets facilitated new opportunities. So it ended up being, roughly, from the studies I remember, the net gain, the net effect was a net gain. So overall, the United States benefited. So yes, automobiles are made in Mexico that previously were made in the United States, but they're made more cheaply, such that the automobiles are sold at a more affordable price here for consumers, good for American consumers. And there are opportunities making goods and services, offering goods and services to Mexico and Canada that were not available. There's always a give and take with international trade. Yes, you lose some, but you also gain some. And in generally, that's redundant. Let me rephrase. Generally, then there is a net gain by all parties involved, because overall the redistribution of economic resources that results from free trade is more efficient and is conducive to greater economic activity and greater economic opportunity. That's a very textbook free trade argument. More specifically, one of the arguments I've heard from the automobile industry itself is that there was not really a significant amount of relocations of factories. Rather, what happened is that some factories were relocated, but a lot of the growth and investment in factories in Mexico was new investment. They were taking advantage in the opportunities proffered by low wages in Mexico, the regulatory environment, the safe investment environment, etc., to expand production. So in that sense, there was not really a significant drop-off in the labor force, the automobile labor force in the United States because of NAFTA. There was a marginal drop-off and a significant increase in employment in Mexico, specifically Mexico's automobile industry, because of new opportunities being taken advantage of. So it's easier to sell cars in Mexico, so you might as well build a bigger factory and sell them. you can sell more cars to the United States than you could before, so bump up production in Mexico to kind of add on to the production you already have in the United States. That's the argument I read. I would want to do more research to judge the veracity of that, because obviously you could argue maybe that's not true, maybe that's a half-truth, etc. But I do remember reading that. So it's difficult to judge the effect of NAFTA, which is basically what you're asking here, because there are so many moving parts, there are so many industries involved, and cost-benefit analyses require you to judge not only primary effects, but also secondary effects and tertiary effects that kind of spin off and affect other industries. So it gets very complicated when you're dealing with a very large free trade deal like NAFTA. But to give you a short answer to the question, if by being ripped off you mean that the United States is worse off because of NAFTA overall, I don't think that's true. I think the United States overall has benefited. If by being ripped off do you mean certain industries have gotten a raw deal, were not really given proper consideration or proper protection, there's a stronger argument there. And if by ripped off you mean that the United States has generated a trade deficit and that certain jobs were shifted to Mexico that could have been done in the United States, then yes, in that case, definitely ripped off. It just kind of depends on how you want to define it. Maybe next year I'll finally get that NAFTA episode finished. I was doing research on NAFTA. That was supposed to be the first podcast episode, but there's a lot of meat to that, so I ended up shifting gears.
Well, you can't make it too hard on yourself, right? Because if you go down the research rabbit hole, you're never going to come out.
Yeah, I'm figuring that out with the thing I'm doing now.
You gotta give those good old caveats of, I'm not an expert on this. This is my perception based on this YouTube video that I watched.
Yeah, I read it on the back of a cereal box. What do you want?
It's hard, I think, to try and find where your niche is in terms of your target audience and also the scientific and analytical rigor you're trying to bring to the content. Because an example is that Art of Viking War book that I'm reading through. There are just citations, like every 2 sentences there's a citation. That's basically pulling as much as you physically can from other stuff, and you're doing an analysis that isn't really any of your own speculation. It's purely just a collection of all the analytical stuff, and then maybe you do fit pieces of the puzzle together, but you're not really imagining any of the spaces in between so much. So trying to find out, like, what is your audience, I think is a good starting point.
Yeah.
Because are you trying to publish a scholarly paper? Yeah, you need every citation you can possibly get. We have the joy of Twitch chat, they're very smart people, but their expertise is all over the place. So if you run into someone who's more of an expert in that area, they can write you a long email. Maybe an angry email, but they can write you a long email, and you can publish a addendum episode of these are the corrections to the previous episode because I got an angry email and they're probably right. Kind of a thing.
Yeah. No, that's good advice.
Yeah.
And I do keep that in mind. If anybody had sent me such an email on the Syria episodes I did, I probably would have done an addendum on that, but not a lot of feedback as of yet. I hope that's a good sign, but who's to say?
Well,
but yeah, fair point. Target demographic is a consideration. It's just kind of hard to judge who that is at this point in the early going.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in your camp in that sense of the Agent Smith content is also part of my product, and I don't know where those, I wouldn't say history buffs, but history and news enthusiasts who want this kind of content, where are you? I want to find you and deliver this stuff that we're doing, and also kind of get feedback on how it can be polished and refined. We do have a lot of really smart people, and the fun thing is we have a really global audience, so they're pretty likely to at least weigh in on certain stuff. At the bare minimum, pronunciation, but also, like, what was it, Rob Ford? When you were talking about the running for Toronto mayor, smoked crack or whatever, the chat was just like Rob Ford, Rob Ford. Just everyone, they knew who that is. I think that's cool.
Yeah, I'll try to encourage. Well, we always encourage feedback. So, I mean, I guess just reiterating here, those listening, please do give us feedback. We do encourage it, and we take it into consideration when you offer it. So, anything that could improve things, any ideas in that vein, are certainly welcome. Let's see. So, do we have more time, or how are we?
I would say maybe 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Gotcha. Let's see. Do you predict any major changes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the near future? No. No, I think that's. I think the Israelis kind of have them right where they want them, so to speak. I think the Netanyahu government is pretty comfortable with the status quo. There's very much a pro-Israeli government in power in the United States right now. The Europeans are kind of trending against Israel. There is kind of global opinion shifting against them a bit in terms of the boycott movement and all that jazz. But they've got the United States on their side. They've got a budding, albeit low-key, alliance with the Saudis emerging, which is, harbors well for the future in the region. That suggests that normalization of relations is possible. Perhaps not imminent, but at least possible going forward. So they've got some good vibes going for them, and in so much as you're a conservative Israeli who wants that land, Judea and Samaria, that also is trending in your favor. That I'm not saying the Israeli government is going to seize the land outright, but their incremental strategy of getting bits and pieces here and there seems to be effective. So if they want to really ramp that up, I don't know that there's a lot anybody could really do about it at this juncture. And the Palestinians, of course, are in utter disarray. The legitimacy of the PLO is kind of in shambles. Hamas still controls the Gaza Strip, and there's still not a lot of... It really doesn't look like there's going to be any reconciliation between the two going forward, at least not anytime soon. So Israel's enemies are in disarray. Israel itself is in a strong position. And in that sense, I think they'll probably be pretty comfortable just sticking with the status quo and not making too many big waves. I think they could. Hypothetically, it's possible, but I don't think it's likely.
Have you seen Monty Python's Life of Brian?
Actually, I haven't.
Dude. You need to. It really just kind of... Yeah. We have the Judeo-Christian kind of cultural foundation of the U.S. There's, as Fuzzy Cord, he's a meme in the chat, he gets to enjoy this broadcast without doing the questions today, but join the People's Front of Judea, and then there's also the it's the Judean People's Front. They're just all these different factions in the region. It's a really great Monty Python piece. If you are a very kind of evangelical conservative Christian, you may be offended at a lot of the content, but I don't think you are. And even then, if you have a lighthearted sense of humor, it's a really good production.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I haven't seen it. I haven't sat down and watched it, but I feel like I've practically seen it, because in high school my friends had seen it and they quoted it constantly.
Yeah.
They were big Monty Python fans back in the day. So I suspect I would get a lot of the jokes. I would find them familiar. But no, I haven't actually seen it yet. I did see Holy Grail.
Holy Grail is the one that is more of my go-to. Life of Brian I've probably seen 2 or 3 times. Holy Grail I've probably seen 15 times.
Yeah. I think I even had that on video way back in the day. Think of it. Good stuff. PBS back in the day was the shit.
Hell yeah.
In so much as I miss having television, that's the aspect that I miss. Documentaries and British sitcoms, I guess, is what you would call them. you're British and listening, know this. PBS is where all your stuff comes after it's been out for a while. We get it a couple years after you.
Have you heard of the British TV series Look Around You?
I have not.
Okay. Well, I just recommended it to a regular and moderator of the stream, Sea of Whiskey. He really likes the British humor style. It is very British, and it's kind of like a mock, educational videos you would watch in school, where it teaches you about some element in chemistry or some shit, and it's like really poorly produced, but it kind of gets the idea across, and it's for students. Basically as low production as they can possibly get away with. It's kind of making fun of that, but it's very meta humor. It's making fun of that production of that kind of content. I would recommend if you like that kind of stuff.
What was the name again?
Look Around You.
Look Around You.
It's on YouTube. You don't have to pirate it or anything.
Oh.
You're hoping to pirate stuff. He's the worst pirate I've ever heard of, but you have heard of me.
That reminds me a little bit of a Canadian TV show that I remember from back in the day. I think it was called The Industry. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's some Canadians listening who maybe know what I'm talking about and correct me, but it was basically about a Canadian film, about the Canadian film industry in one particular firm, and some of the corporate politics that go on within it. It was pretty interesting to watch. I have fond memories of it from back in college when it was on at 1 a.m. or whenever. Let's see. So I think I can slip in a few more. Despite its dysfunction, government seems like it's becoming more aware of the power wielded by Amazon and other megacorporations. What might government do to curtail exercise of that power? Does sufficient political will exist? Let's see. So what might government do to curtail? It depends on what you mean by power, because you could interpret that as political power or economic power. I'm going to infer that you mean economic power. So yes, there are very large corporations like Amazon and certain social media companies that are also pretty dominant. They do have a lot of market power. The question is, do they have too much market power? And that's tricky, because the criteria you use to determine whether a firm is a monopoly or monopolistic, rather, varies from industry to industry. Nominally, there is a fixed formula, I think, for kind of determining it, but invariably, industries argue that their case is special, and then this, that, or the other dynamic of their process, production process, or what have you, should imply that they get a exemption of some kind or some flexibility. So the question then is, why do these firms have large market power? If they have large market power because they are employing unfair measures in order to eat up more market share than they would get in a perfectly competitive environment, in that case, you could build a much stronger case for government action to kind of rein them in. But if their market power is the result of natural economic evolution, so to speak, natural competition, in that case, the argument is much weaker. And so in that case, probably nothing will be done. What the government can do is basically, to be more specific, about what the government can do, basically antitrust action. There are nominally antitrust laws in the United States, but generally they don't get enforced much, or more accurately, when they are enforced, it is found that the cases in question are not applicable. Generally, the industries in question successfully argue that they should not be subject to those laws, or more accurately, those laws are not applicable to their particular industry's particular parochial circumstances. Well, not parochial, it's not quite proprietary, shall we say, their industry's proprietary circumstances. So that's nominally the power by which the government would crack down on them. The principal one, anyway. And when you get into something like social media companies, it gets even more thorny, because how do you gauge competitiveness of a social media company? Social media companies are almost like, well, not even phone companies, really, because there's a network effect that affects the value of the service in the case of a social media company. the more people that use a social media service, the more valuable it becomes. It kind of lends itself then, the social media industry, so to speak, that dynamic, that social networking dynamic lends itself to one or two large firms emerging from competition in that field, in that market. Just because it doesn't make a lot of sense for one group of people to go to one service and then another group of people to use a different service, and they can't communicate with each other. The utility of the service is increased the more people that use it, so it makes sense for broad swaths of the population to use just one, two, probably just one. That's the case with stuff like Facebook or Instagram. So in a market like that, how do you judge whether a firm has monopolistic power or not, given that the nature of the industry and market itself inherently lends itself to concentration of power in a few firms? That's a tricky question, and that's not something that economics really has a great answer for, given that the industry is so new and so unique. So that's the trouble with bringing to bear government power to deal with large corporations in that vein. As for whether political will exists, probably not yet. There is some political will, but I don't think it's really sufficient to really start a big political conversation about antitrust laws and how they should apply to some of the new technology firms that have emerged. We're getting there. I think it is increasing. I think the trend is rising I think the trend is definitely towards more antitrust legislation and more, at least, questioning of what the government's regulatory responsibility should be vis-a-vis technology companies. So in the future, we'll probably get there. But for now, I don't think so. I don't think there's quite that political will. The zeitgeist at the moment is kind of a response to the Obama administration. A lot of people who voted for Trump were not voting for Trump so much as they were voting against Obama. Kind of in the same way that a lot of people who voted for Obama in 2008 were voting more against Bush than they were for Obama. But for now, the zeitgeist is kind of more conservative. But that could change. We're, again, like we were saying, like I was talking about earlier, we're very much in a period of tumult. It's very much a period of uncertainty, and there's a lot of turbulence, so to speak, historically speaking, and going on in the United States right now. So who's to say what direction politically we'll take going forward? But given the trends, again, I suspect that eventually that probably will be manifested in policy at some point within the next probably 10, 15 years. Roughly. Again, that's a guess on my part. When will android/humanoid robots, which can assist us with everyday duties, be available on a widespread market? And what do you think the consequences of this will be?
Ooh, ask Ray Kurzweil.
There you go. Yeah, you would have to ask somebody who knows a lot more about the state of the robotics industry and robotics technology to get a good answer to that. And I don't know enough about the state of the industry to comment on it. So I don't know when they'll get here. Sorry?
If I can hazard a extrapolation, what do we have? What's it called? The Roomba?
Yeah.
That is a robot that has a level of intelligence that can complete a task, vacuuming the floor, cleaning the floor. We have smartphones around us, so I think a lot of this is we have computers with those partial duties or complete duties for a given task that we don't really think of as robots in the science fiction sense, where it's a robot butler who has a name who talks back to you. Alexa is one example of that. Amazon's little responsive computer tool you can have just sitting on your desk where you can say, play Despacito because I'm sad or something. Like, that's already around us, but it's in fragments currently. And like, when does the critical mass happen where we consider ourselves to be surrounded by robots? We already kind of are. It's more of just when we draw the line in the sand and say, yes, robots are among us, versus, well, when is that going to happen?
Mm-hmm. And I would add here, referring to the second part of the question, what do you think the consequences will be? It really depends on what you mean by everyday duties. Because if you just mean like household chores, then the impact probably won't be that great. It'll probably just mean a little more free time for individuals, families, what have you. But if by everyday duties you mean repetitive labor, the result could be significant, because that could significantly dislocate a lot of wage labor, so to speak, blue-collar labor, depending on how it's implemented. So different possibilities depending on the interpretation there. But really, the real answer here is that it's too early to tell what the consequences will be. We're still very early in that process, and it's not really clear how the technology will evolve, how society will evolve, how the regulatory regime will evolve, etc. So we kind of need more answers to those questions in order to make a more solid prediction. I think the real question here is, when are we going to have sex bots? That's the important issue, and I don't know when that will be. That's unclear. That could resolve a lot of social tension. That's got some real potential. Huh?
Yeah. I do like a throat clearing thing whenever something sexual happens. So an example would be someone requests a song that has a music video that has a lot of very attractive women in it. I will sometimes do this video, and it's kind of an implication sort of thing.
Gotcha.
Where Twitch, they've taken a stance that is a little bit reining in the sexuality, kind of in the PG-13 range, I think is where they tend to draw the line. But yeah, you could say that the what's this community, this modern meme, incels, they're gonna have some trouble once they're just sex robots running amok. They're gonna have to figure out, like, what is our identity now, kind of a thing.
Satisfied, I expect.
Well, we'll see. Depends on how good they are, I guess. But yeah, it's true that there are a lot of social and economic implications for different mechanical creatures kind of doing more of what humans historically have done. Like, what then do we do with our time? It's sort of a modern existential crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely going to be significant implication. But hopefully, the ideal outcome is that they relieve tensions such that... What? Well,
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
I thought you were doing that on purpose.
No, it is relieve damn it. Okay. Yeah, relieve tensions between the genders, politically speaking. Relieve political tensions between gender. This is what I get for venturing down this path. But yeah, that's kind of the idea. There are potentially big social implications for that technology should it eventually reach maturity. That's kind of more the point I was going for. So let's see. That's the robots question. Kind of blow through these here. I guess that's it. I guess we could wrap up from there. We can kind of pick up next time.
Sweet.
If that's okay.
Well, yeah, we had a question from Mas Neotech about trolley questions in the chat, and I think there's a fun quote that I said a few times. It's a Bruce Lee question, I think, or a quote. The wise can learn more from a foolish question than a fool can learn from a wise answer. So sometimes we'll get a silly question in the chat that is meant to be bait to trick us to that it's silly, or trolly where it's obviously absurd, but sometimes we gather something useful from it. So I think we can embrace some memes. We've had a lot of fun tonight, and with some of the questions we can joke around Djibouti, that kind of stuff. But this is a more serious segment than when I'm just normally playing StarCraft and video games and all that, but we can have fun too. It doesn't need to be C-SPAN.
Yeah, throw in a little curveball every now and again.
Yep.
Just to keep it light.
Just to relieve some tensions. Man, sometimes the unintentional walking into innuendo is the best.
Yeah.
You just
Yeah,
you just lead up to it, and then you're just trying to move on to something serious, and then you just walk right back into it, and you're like, fuck. It's a rotating door.
yeah, I find myself in such rotating doors disturbingly often. I frequently have to extract my foot from my mouth.
It's okay. You didn't break the terms of service. I'm not mad at you.
Oh, thank you. I would not want to antagonize my patron. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be on here and get to spend some time with you and talk with you, and interact with chat as well. Even though I guess I didn't mention it before. I don't read chat while we do this, but I do read it after. So I will see what you post later, and I do learn a lot from chat and from the insight and perspectives that chat brings to the conversation.
Oh, we already have demand now for a Djibouti emote. We just have the Djibouti flag. There's a Canadian streamer who hosted us. His name is Jason. And one of his emotes is a Canadian flag. We just have a Djibouti flag, and people are like, what? Isn't Neuro American? Yeah, well, you have to come on Sunday nights, you'll understand.
A little inside joke for your viewers.
Yeah.
Let me see. I'm looking at, before we go, I'm looking at the country chart again.
Mm-hmm.
I always pop by. Oh, I noticed we have one from Colombia. Cool. Yeah, Colombia has been had some interesting politics over the past few years given the peace deal with FARC. So I guess my question, I'll ask this to the person from Colombia, and they don't have to answer, but what do you think about the peace deal with FARC? Because I know that's pretty divisive down there. There's a lot of differing opinions. So what is your opinion? I would be curious to see what the opinion of an authentic Colombian would be on the matter. Just throwing that out. Just throwing that out there.
Well, cool. So this has been episode 39 of World Discussion with Agent Smith. It will be on YouTube. Eventually, it will be on the Twitch VODs, basically tonight, a little bit later. I think this one was more fun than usual. I think a lot of that was accidental, but we'll take it. But yeah, good stuff. Thank you very much, Musk, Tech Prototype, for handing along the questions, and for chat being funny and enjoying the broadcast. I had a good one.
Ditto. Thanks again for having me on. Much appreciated, as always.
Cheers, dude. We should be good to go. So we have, let me just pull up a calendar for you real fast, because I have TwitchCon and BlizzCon in the near future. So we have, next week is the 7th, we should be good. 14th should be good. 21st, we should be good. The 28th and the 4th, that 2-week block will be California for me. But after that, we should be back on track.
Gotcha.
But yeah, good stuff. Good having you on. Just got a $5 for you from Starion. Dropping the knowledge bombs. Thanks, Agent Smith.
Thank you very much, Starion. Much appreciated.
Cool. Well, we'll see you soon, fam. Thank you, Agent Smith. And we'll see you next week.
Yep. See you next week. Thanks again.
Nice. Will you be at BlizzCon? Yes. Yes, I shall. That was pretty awesome. That was a funny one.